welcome everybody. This is a meeting of the Maine Climate Council, the first meeting of the council since the council met in January. My name is David Plum, and I will be helping to run today's meeting and tomorrow's meeting. I'm just going to give a quick overview of how things are going to work today, and then I'll turn it over to the two co-chairs of the Maine Climate Council. But let me just say a few words about how we're going to work together today. We are adapting like everybody else and bringing things online. So we turned what was going to be a full day meeting into 2 mornings online. We're going to try to provide some really powerful presentations today about the work of the working groups and some reflections around it. Today and tomorrow, it's all about hearing what the working groups have done and reacting to it and what that means for your process as the Maine Climate Council. And your co-chairs will speak a little bit more about that in just a moment. So let me turn it over to your co-chairs of the Maine Climate Council, Director Hannah Pingree, Commissioner Jerry Reed, to kick us off today.
Thanks a lot, David. This is Jerry, and I just want to start by saying welcome to everyone and thank you on behalf of Governor Mills to everyone for being here on such a beautiful day. And thank you for all of your work and your participation in this process. And when we think back on how much work has been accomplished in the last 8 months or so, it really is staggering. And I think it should be noted that for the vast majority of people who are involved in this process, the work that they've been doing has been kind of extracurricular in the sense that it's just been added on to their normal day-to-day work responsibilities. And yet they've embraced it with such passion and such commitment. And so we are so grateful and we are so impressed with the work that's been done so far. And we're going to keep hitting that theme because we are really sincere in saying that. And the other thing I just want to observe at the outset is when I think about the ongoing relevance and urgency of the work of the Climate Council, despite everything else that's going on in the world today with the pandemic and the economic problems and the civil rights struggles that are all kind of playing out in the background here, I really feel like the work of the council is as relevant as it's ever been, because at least a couple things seem clear to me. And one is we really have no assurance at all when the pandemic may subside. And we have no assurance, certainly, when the federal government may take any meaningful action on climate change. So it's incumbent on the states to take a leadership role. And that's what we're doing here with the Climate Council. And you know, in doing that, I think you're going to see in the strategies that are introduced today, many of them have important co-benefits that are relevant to those other issues I mentioned, whether it's public health benefits or benefits that will assist and promote in the economic recovery that we're going to be looking for, or benefits that may provide more equity to marginalized subpopulations in our communities. All those things are important for so many reasons today, and I think you're going to see those themes play out in the strategies that are introduced to you today. So again, thank you very much for being here. We're going to be really conscious of staying on schedule, but I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to offer a few introductory remarks too.
Great, thank you, Jerry. And it really is truly awesome to see all of our Climate Council members back together again, and to see hundreds of people who are here and engaged and interested, many of whom are working group members. But again, it just shows really the urgency of this issue, how many people care and how many people have stayed engaged despite the changing context, the changing world we're all living in. I think Jerry laid it out. We have certainly seen huge shifts in our work, huge shifts in our state, in our economy. But I'm sure if you clicked on the front page of the New York Times today, major headline about global emissions continuing now back on track and rising. So the urgency to our work is certainly still with us. And I will say it has been with the group of people who are largely on this Zoom call this morning. People have really dug in despite the changing context. So just quick overview of the agenda today. Today really marks an important day where we start to hear from the working groups. People have been working for months. So I think folks have seen this before. This is really the overview of these bubbles represent 230 people who have been putting in an unbelievable amount of time and energy over the last almost now 9 months. So I think today is a shift where a lot of the work shifts from the working groups back to the Maine Climate Council. But it is an important day to really just thank the people who are in each of these bubbles. They have put in, as Jerry said, an unbelievable amount of time as volunteers or on top of their day jobs. Again, there are 230 people represented in these working groups. This entire structure shifted in March from in-person meetings to what we all have become very familiar with, the Zoom call. And many of us have spent our lives on Zoom the last couple months, but I think for these Maine Climate Council working groups, I would say the endurance of being able to manage a multiple-hour meeting and decision-making process on Zoom really has been remarkable. I know in the month of April, there were 30 meetings, Climate Council working group meetings, which just sort of shows, we certainly can't, we don't measure ourselves in meetings alone, but it does show really the energy and the enthusiasm despite the times that we're living in. So again, Jerry and I want to just thank the co-chairs who really have led these working groups, all of the members who come from across the state and are doing this with kids at home and day jobs and lots of other changing conditions, staff and facilitators who have put in so many hours to make this work successful, and to the many, many people who have observed the process, offered their comments, engaged. We've certainly had ad hoc like committee members who have been at every meeting, who really care about this process and want to make sure it turns out well. So again, just a very big thank you. We are not running a victory lap, but we know that where we are today is the product of just an unbelievable amount of work and commitment on behalf of so many people. So just to ground us where we are today, I think folks have seen the timeline before, but we started this council in June with the governor signing the bill and starting to appoint the members. From October to today, the working groups and the Science and Technical Committee have met and offered what we're going to hear today, their first round of strategies and recommendations. So again, really I'd say the heaviest lifting has happened in the working groups over these last 9 months. We are now at June, and this process is sort of a handoff back to the Maine Climate Council, where the working groups don't go away. They're not totally done with their work. They all sort of have different work in front of them over the summer, but it's a really important time to sort of recognize that this is now come back to this yellow bubble. And this yellow bubble, I love the infographic of the people swirling heads going around, because it really is the heavy lifting of starting to figure out, how do these strategies fit together? How do we make decisions? How do we prioritize? You're going to hear a little bit more today and tomorrow, but between June and September, we have a process that will add a couple layers to this. We have a cost-benefit analysis and data modeling that will help us understand each strategy and what they will mean for emissions reductions. We have a public engagement process, which you'll hear more about today, where we really want to make sure people in Maine understand the work that we're doing and are able to weigh in. And then we're also working on an equity analysis to really understand the impacts on different groups in Maine and how we improve the equity of the equity understandings of each of our recommendations. So it's important work. We'll be back together as a Climate Council in September, and that is really when decision making starts. So between September and November, the Climate Council will have all this additional information, and we will have to start making decisions so that we can finalize a report by December 1. So it's incredibly important work. I would say that today is sort of the beginning of the council starting to understand the strategies, and again, all the hard work that has happened in the committees. I'm going to hand this back to Jerry, and Jerry's going to have a chance also to introduce our special guest, who actually is a member of the Maine Climate Council, our celebrity member, Dr. Shah, who has, as I would assume most of you, doesn't need a lot of introduction, but we are incredibly excited to have him here today to help ground us in really how these issues relate to the pandemic and all that we've been living through over the last 4 months. And so I'll hand it back to Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So this slide provides kind of the legal framework to a lot of what we're doing with the Climate Council. You see the governor's commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. That's set forth in one of our executive orders. And you see the by now familiar emission reduction targets, 45% below 1990 levels by 2030. That's gross emission reductions that we're talking about, and then 80% by 2050. And then, as Hannah mentioned, the obligation in the statute for us to deliver an updated climate action plan by December 1st of this year. So we're going to be hearing today from the energy, buildings, and transportation working groups. And as you know, those are the three sectors of the economy that are responsible for the vast majority of our emissions. So they're very relevant to those emission reduction targets that you see on the screen there. We've talked about how these numbers are ambitious, but they're appropriately ambitious. And by that, what I mean is that they're not numbers that are plucked out of the thin air. They are numbers that the experts tell us are what we need to achieve by way of emission reductions if we are to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So the statute itself is very much grounded in science, and all of the work of the Climate Council is very much science-driven. And that is also, as we know, how this governor likes to govern. She's very much all about the science and the data and the evidence, and that's how she makes her decisions, whether we're talking about the Climate Council or whether we're talking about the response to the global pandemic. And as Hannah said, we are really lucky to have with us this morning Dr. Nirav Shah, the head of the Maine CDC, who's been heading the administration's response to the pandemic and doing a masterful job in that capacity. I think we would all agree that Maine has never needed a more capable and strong leader of the CDC than in the past year, and we've been so lucky to have Dr. Shah in that role. And I will also say that Hannah and I did very well by buying some shares in Dr. Shah last year when they were still affordable, and we had him commit to being a member of the council and also to being a co-chair of one of our working groups, the Community Resilience Planning, Public Health, and Emergency Management Working Group. So he's been very much part of the process here, and he's going to talk to us this morning about some of his thoughts and ideas about how the response to the pandemic has lessons for us that are transferable to our work on climate change issues. So Dr. Shah, thank you very much for taking some time to be with us this morning and for all your work with this process.
Well, thank you so much, Commissioner Reed, Director Pingree. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nirav Shah, the Director of the Maine CDC, and I'm really delighted to be able to join everyone for a bit this morning. I'm honored to be here and provide a bit of a thought or lay the groundwork for some discussion about what I see as some of the nexuses between the work of climate change and the pending work that's ongoing in connection with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to thank, first of all of my colleagues on the Climate Council, in particular, as Commissioner Reed noted, a big shout out to the members of the Community Resilience Planning, Public Health, and Emergency Management Working Group. I don't think when that subgroup started working almost a year ago now, I don't think any of us could have imagined a situation that would have put those three issues, community resilience planning, public health, and emergency management, into sharper focus than they are now with in connection with the work around COVID-19. I'd also like to thank my two co-chairs, Judy East and Annie Fuchs, for picking up a lot of the slack as I've been focused on the COVID-19 work. And of course, give a big thanks to Rebecca Lincoln from the Maine CDC and Becca Boulos from the Maine Public Health Association for keeping the public health side of that work going. What I'd like to do today in my short time is make three observations about that nexus between climate change work and COVID-19, and perhaps even look to some of the early lessons from COVID-19 and how they might inform some of the ongoing work around climate change. My three observations, one is a practical one, the second is a bit more academic, and then the third is very truly pressing. So we'll start with the more practical one. And that first observation is a simple but I think important one, which is that the reduction of the number of cases of COVID-19 and reduction of carbon emissions in service of improving climate change, both at their base fundamentally require behavior change, wide-ranging behavior change across the entire public, across the state, across the country, across the globe. And whether in the case of COVID, that entails staying at home and wearing a face mask, or for climate issues, encouraging greater use of public transportation and wiser purchasing decisions and other carbon reducing measures, they both fundamentally require wide-scale behavior change. And I think all of us know that even from our own personal lives, behavior change is really hard. Even when you try to initiate your behavior change, it's hard. If you've ever tried to drop a couple of pounds, but let alone behavior change that is recommended, if not imposed, by external entities, especially in some cases the government, it's even harder. For decades, for example, public health has tried to get folks to stop smoking, eat better, and exercise more. And our success, although it's been palpable, has been slow. It's taken maybe 60 or 70 years for definable, real changes to have been made. But what COVID has taught us, and what I think climate change can learn from, is that these wide-ranging, life-altering behavior changes that I candidly thought were frankly impossible months ago, are not just now possible, but can be widely embraced by wide swaths of the population. To quote, no one greater than Mandela, everything is impossible until it actually happens. And in service of COVID-19, we have asked people to fundamentally change the way they live, the way they learn, the way they work, the way they play, in radically different ways from just a couple of months ago. And what's been striking to me is the fact that folks have done it. Sure, we all read about folks that maybe you see at the supermarket who aren't wearing a mask. But what's really remarkable is that so many individuals are, and that businesses have radically changed the way that they offer their services. Universities have significantly changed the way that education happens, and families have radically changed the way that they interact with friends. It's evidence that climate change work that entails the same types of behavior change, that behavior change can happen. So in that connection, COVID sort of provides us a roadmap that demonstrates that hard behavior changes can be accomplished. And in this case, with respect to climate change, transition to a less carbon intensive lifestyle is possible. And that we can effectuate really big changes when the size and the scope and the magnitude of the problem is both large enough, when it's obvious that the benefits are real, and I think this is the critical piece, when the rationale for those changes is communicated to the public with clear, consistent messaging. Now, of course, I'm not blind to the fact that there is a glaring difference between COVID and climate change. COVID is a short-term, hopefully a short-term issue that arose very quickly with victims who were very clearly seen by all. Climate is harder. Its effects are diffuse, and it's a longer-term issue. But candidly, my view is that is fundamentally an issue of framing and messaging, not a substantive difference. I think for many folks across the globe, across the country, and perhaps even in Maine, climate issues remain as pressing as ever and could rank for many communities just as pressing as COVID-19 issues. And what we've learned is that when we frame big issues as a matter of community responsibility and overall survival, our own people within the state of Maine can take big action and do radical things. So we should take heart in that. Don't ever let anyone tell you that climate action is not possible. To the extent anyone out there is saying that, I would recommend you point them to the amazing strides that our own state in Maine has taken with respect to COVID-19, and at least the preliminary successes that we've had. If we treated climate messaging the same way that we treated COVID messaging, the question is, could we galvanize even more people to action? That's my first observation. The second observation is candidly and admittedly a bit more academic, but it's something that I think about a lot. And it involves the following thought experiment. Everyone, I'm sure, is no doubt familiar with the situation that transpired many centuries ago on Easter Island, when the islanders of Easter Island cut down the last tree. And at least according to some environmental experts and anthropologists, the complete deforestation of the island led to an ensuing ecological collapse that, again, at least by some historians' account, led to the complete societal collapse. The question that I've always had in my mind is, what were the people who cut down the very last tree on Easter Island saying when they were cutting down that tree? Were they saying, hey, look, we're just doing what we were told to be doing. I'm just doing a job here. Were they saying, oh boy, I don't know if this is a great idea. Maybe someone should speak up and say this could have some long-term consequences? Were they saying, you know, this is a short-term thing, but technology will save us? No matter what you think that those folks were saying, if they were even saying anything at all, the warning signs were there. The warning signs were clear that that type of deforestation could lead to unforeseen consequences that could then lead to political and other disasters that did in fact ensue. In regulatory circles, this is a classic collective action problem. Everybody knew that there was a problem out there, but society couldn't organize itself in such a fashion to tackle the problem and to address the problem. The parallels between that and our current climate situation, and of course COVID-19, are too stark to ignore. The signs were there with respect to the possible emergence of a global pandemic. For decades, administrations, leaders across the country, across the globe, hadn't taken that threat seriously enough. We're now in a similar situation and have been for years with respect to climate change. And I think the academic question that hangs in the air is what are we going to say about that? Fortunately, we are in a state like Maine, where we're not just sitting around saying, well, technology is going to solve this, or, you know what, that's a problem for other people in a couple of generations to sort out. I think we should take pride in the fact that we're not just sitting around cutting down that last tree, but rather taking action against it. Especially, however, in situations like this. Collective action problems are the most difficult to deal with when there's a high magnitude but low probability event. But as we get closer and closer to more definable impacts from climate change, the probability becomes higher and the magnitude becomes too high to ignore. The same happens with respect to preparation for global pandemics. One of the words that has been used to describe the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps more than anything else, is that it was unprecedented. Perhaps that's true, but now it is no longer unprecedented. In fact, it's the opposite. There is clear precedent for what can happen when you fail to heed the signs that a global pandemic could occur. The same thing applies to climate change. There are clear and unignorable signs of what can happen if we ignore the threats of climate change on the horizon. So that's the second point, a bit admittedly academic, but I think a thought experiment that's worth all of us thinking about. The third observation that I wanted to make today is the pressing one, which is the, again, unmistakable and unignorable parallels from a health equity perspective between the impact of climate change and the impact of COVID-19. What we've seen with both climate change as well as with COVID-19 is that they affect the most vulnerable members of our society. Both climate change and in my case with the work in public health and pandemics, COVID-19, it hasn't created cracks in society so much as it has exposed the cracks that were already and always there. Just in our own state of Maine, with respect to COVID-19, there are unacceptable disparities in the impact of COVID-19 on racial and ethnic minorities as compared to non-racial and ethnic minorities. More generally, the same can be said with respect to climate change and its impacts. Now, there are a number of reasons why these health inequities manifest. and each and every one of them is unacceptable. But what we've seen is that both climate change as well as COVID-19 have disparate impacts on lower income individuals, individuals who have been historically marginalized, who have been disaffected and disenfranchised, and as a result have borne the brunt of each and every one of the major health crises that we faced. Climate change and COVID-19 are but two of them. Whether we're talking about vaccine preventable diseases, chronic illnesses, or a number of other societal ills, these social determinants of health bear out, and the folks that pay the largest and highest price for those are typically, and in this case, the most marginalized members of society. I know that one of the charges of the Climate Council is to address these health inequities head on, and I wanted to draw that parallel between what we've seen that is unacceptable with respect to COVID-19 and what we could expect to see that's already materialized in other states. You need look no further than the disparate impact of, say, Hurricane Katrina on low-impact citizens of New Orleans to see the potential for the same type of situation to play out here in Maine were a disaster of that sort to strike. So I'd like to, again, thank Director Pingree, Commissioner Reed for giving me some time today to share some of these observations, both with respect to COVID-19 and the work of climate change. We've got a long road ahead of us, but at least we are organized, we agree as to what the issues are, and I think there are things that the COVID situation can instruct us to do a better and more efficacious job with respect to climate. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking some time to chat with me this morning. I'll turn things back over to Director Pingree and Commissioner Reed.
Dr. Shaw, thank you so much. That was wonderful as always. Please consider that you're getting a standing ovation from all 500 of us who are on this call right now. There's been some activity on the chat line indicating a desire to do that, and I know we all feel it right now. You have a real gift for making incredibly compelling points in such a clear fashion, and that was really great. I'm just going to try to strike an optimistic tone in response to the first observation you were making, which is about the ability of society to make really significant behavioral changes quickly when there's a need to do so to address a serious threat. And I think we'll see that in one of the strategies we'll talk about later today in teleworking and telecommuting, which is such a kind of a mundane concept, but it's really important because it embodies so many different benefits to the issues that we're talking about. In terms of an economic recovery benefit, telecommuting can offer employees a chance to save money, which could be really important for those living on a tight budget. It can offer employers a chance to save money because they can reduce the physical footprint of their offices. It can obviously reduce carbon emissions, which is what we're all about on this Climate Council, but it can also reduce emissions of conventional pollutants, which are really important in terms of the potential public health benefit related to things like ozone pollution and particulate emissions. And of course, in the public health context, there's also the co-benefit of a social distancing dimension to telecommuting, which is why we've all gone to it so quickly. So it's a winner in all those categories. And we're going to see other examples of strategies like that have these kind of multidisciplinary co-benefits associated with them. And they're available to us, and we are capable of adopting them and making the changes that we need to take advantage of those benefits. So whether it's changes that have additional benefits to communities that make them healthier, or better preparing the state of Maine to respond to the next shock, whether it's in the form of a pandemic or climate change or whatever the next major challenge may be that's coming down the pike. These strategies have many co-benefits that we will highlight throughout the day. So I'll ask Hannah if she has any additional observations that she'd like to make at this point based on what we've heard so far.
Great, thank you, Jerry. And it's honestly, Jerry and I should never ever line ourselves up to speak after Dr. Shaw again, but Thank you, Nirav. That was amazing. And again, Jesse Perkins posted in the chat, we'd be all giving you a monstrous standing ovation, but it has been a slog. I would say, just to really highlight the point that Jerry started to make, I mean, we are living through a global pandemic, and we are also, as a result, in a tremendous economic recession in Maine and certainly across the country and world. These economic challenges have impacted our work. It has impacted the thinking of the working groups, and it has certainly also highlighted challenges and overlaps between climate and the economy. I think the good news is, and again, a hopeful note, is that you'll hear strategies today and data about the potential for climate strategies and positive economic activity in Maine, whether in our energy sector, efficiency sector, manufacturing, infrastructure. There are opportunities to address climate change and create good paying jobs in Maine. That is actually a huge opportunity for our state. So as we seek to rebuild from this recession, it's crucial that we focus on creating new jobs and rebuilding in a way that creates opportunity for Maine, opportunity across our state for marginalized people, for rural areas, whether it's bringing back a shuttered mill in Madison to manufacture high quality insulation products, using Maine forest products, or training young people in Lewiston in the green energy and efficiency sector. We have an opportunity to address climate, and you'll again hear about it in the presentations this morning, in a way that creates good paying jobs for our state. We also hope, our hope is well placed in that the federal government will consider how to help states recover from this recession in a way that rebuilds our state's infrastructure and economies. We certainly saw in 2009 tremendous benefit in Maine in our efficiency sector and in our energy sector, recovery money come to our state. And again, that's something that we hope, and many of the working groups have been thinking about shovel-ready projects that will overlap both putting people back to work and helping to figure out solutions for climate. So again, you'll hear about strategies today to meet our aggressive emissions targets and become more resilient. Strategies that will support sustainable communities, will save people and communities and businesses money, and create good paying jobs. So again, I think you'll hear this as a theme throughout the 2 days, a theme that becomes more important as our economic context has changed significantly, and really an opportunity. I think the messaging that Dr. Shaw talked about, messages that give people hope for the ability to address both climate change and some of our economic challenges. So we're going to throw it back to David and really shift to the meat of the day, which is the hard work and recommendations of the working groups.
Fantastic. Okay, before we do the presentations, let's take the temperature of the group. We actually have a moment here to have a conversation about what we're just talking about, which is this intersection of our reality and how much it's changed since March, or since January, since we last met, and the work of your work as a Climate Council. My colleague Sophia is going to put in the chat just for the panelists, right? So this is taking the temperature of Climate Council members and the other folks who are the panelists on this call today. This is a quick poll. If everyone could just click on that link in the chat real quick and take that poll. We're going to do 2 quick temperature checks with some polling right now as a way to figure out where we are, right? So click on that link that's in the chat from Sophia right now and answer that first question. Sophia's there going to share her screen. We can see the answer to it. I'll ask you one more question after we've done that. There we go. How much has climate change been on your radar in the 3 months we got Cassie's email on June 11th with all those initial strategies from the working groups? Here we go. So just let's, Sophia can see how many folks have answered. We can see these moving in real time. Okay, great, good. So this will move around a little bit, but the bottom line there is climate is still part of your story, right? This has not gone away. We have been very, very preoccupied with a pandemic and economic recession and everything related, and yet we still have climate as part of our story here. All right, let's go to the second question. And this one is asking you to do just a quick sort of ordering exercise to get a sense of how you want to see your Climate Council work adapt and reflect the moment that we're living in. So here are some options, and these reflect what you just heard from Commissioner Reed and from Director Pingree, right? How should the Climate Council incorporate the impacts of the pandemic into its work, right? Right? Should we look for opportunities to save people money through lowering their energy costs? Emphasize resiliency and preparedness, right? Develop and emphasize shovel-ready projects that would be good candidates for stimulus funding. Emphasize ideas that make Mainers healthier. I think it's all right. We can see the ones that are rising to the top here. Does anybody else need to vote still? Again, we are taking the temperature. This is nothing formal. This is just getting a sense of, we know it's important, right, to be attentive to this moment we're in. The moment is different than January, all right? So some of the ways we can be attentive are thinking about these shovel-ready initiatives, looking for opportunities to save energy costs, emphasizing resiliency. Okay, great. Let's just take a few moments here. Maybe it's just 5 minutes or so, or 10 minutes. And if we want to say some things, this is an opportunity for us to raise our hands. So if anybody just wants to chime in reaction to what we heard from Dr. Shaw, from Commissioner Reed, from Director Pingree, this is an opportunity before we dive into our presentations from the working groups. Are there any comments that folks want to make? Anya, I see your hands up. You want to go ahead?
Thanks for everyone's presentation so far. It's good to see you all on Zoom. I just really appreciate, Dr. Shaw, what you were talking about with health equity and the connections between COVID and climate, being that they're exposing cracks that are already there. And that's just something that I would encourage us all to really think about with our solutions, if we're perpetuating those cracks or if we're gonna get rid of those cracks. And I think those are all important questions to ask. So I really appreciate you raising that.
Thanks, Anya. Andrew Pershing?
Hi, thanks. I really appreciated Dr. Shaw's 3 points of connection between climate and COVID. And I'd add one that sort of underlined all of it as well, in that we're really, in both cases, asking people to make really big decisions about a world that they haven't experienced. We're really having to put a lot of faith into models and projections, which I think is incredibly uncomfortable for a lot of people to do. And so I think that's a really important thing that we're going to have to grapple with throughout both crises.
Thanks so much. Any other comments we want to make on this sort of initial framing and how different it is from where we were in January? Any other folks? Any other comments?
This is Lydia, Representative Bloom. I feel like that we're making more of an emphasis. I feel like it's sort of changed or focused me from a legislative standpoint, that we really do have to look at how we're going to, what are the cost benefits, the shovel ready initiatives that really got my eye, got my ear. Those things are extremely relevant as we go into a lower money, lower revenues arena. So I feel that's sort of shifting a little bit, and that that ERG work is going to be very important to establishing what we're going to be able to do, I think, going forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah. Are there other comments? Brownie Carson.
Yeah, good morning and thank you. I think Dr. Shaw's comments were profound in some respects, as we, particularly in the Transportation Working Group, have looked at options. There has been a sense of, I think, we don't know how differently we can do things. This would be experimental. This would be unprecedented. This would be more costly. This is not the way we've always done things, and it would be uncomfortable for us. But the fact of the matter, I believe, is that there's a real necessity here for all the reasons and more that he stated. And being bold, being serious, making investments that we've not made before is going to be really, really important. Thanks.
Thank you. Great. I see a few more hands. Stephen Foley, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just going off of what's been said, I think this is a time that we're going to have to look at restructuring our economy in general, and also the ways that we just continue conducting business as we move forward. So I think it's a great time to have, this kind of group that we have together to be looking at all the issues in a way that can really create a more resilient, not only economy, but environment to live in for the future. So I appreciate Dr. Shaw and everyone else putting in all the work that's been done. Thank you.
Thank you. I see one more comment from Matt. Go ahead, Matt, please.
Yeah, Matt Schlobom with the Maine AFL-CIO, and thanks so much, Dr. Shaw, for your leadership and your comments. I think the other sphere where your point about rapid behavioral change hitting a tipping point feels like in the sphere of racial justice right now, where we're just seeing transformations of attitudes, behaviors that are moving towards systemic action. And it's just, I think it's like in this sort of three-pronged crisis we're in, important to lift up, particularly as you note the deep structural inequities that underpin this. And it does feel like we're at this pivot point where the world will not be the same, and people are both hungry for some return to normalcy and pretty clear-eyed that we can't return to the same normal. And I think in our communication and in our approach, two things seem really important. Similar to the last speaker, I think our economics have to be married to our climate transition. People feel deep economic insecurity, and if we don't figure out how to address that in climate sustainable ways and deeply transform the structures of our economy, I don't think we can win hearts and minds and bring people along with the structural and personal changes we need. And then the second piece is just related to the messaging and framing. I think this notion of experimentation and like an American spirit is important to invoke now. If you think about comparable historical periods, whether it's Reconstruction or the New Deal, there was a clear sensibility and style of leadership that said, we are going to try and try and try until we get these things right. And so I just think we have to embrace that. And that usually means try, fail, breakthrough. And, and I think there's no escaping the urgency of the federal government acting in that realm, which is obviously a pretty deep conundrum right now. But just wanted to lift those things up and really appreciate your perspective.
Thanks so much. So let's do this. Let's switch gears and start to listen to these presentations. We're going to do 3 this morning. We've also been capturing these comments you've made, and we're going to show those not to you right now, but later we're going to show you a summary of that. So we have that captured. This is not into the wind, right? Everything's being captured. But we're going to transition now into 3 presentations. And the 3 that you'll hear today, and you'll hear 3 more tomorrow, but today's have a heavy emphasis on the emissions reductions, right? So that's why we're going to start with the buildings and housing infrastructure group, and then we're going to move on to transportation, then we're going to move on to the energy group to round us up. I'm going to say a few things before we dive into the actual presentation. One is you're going to be receiving in your email, like literally right now, from Cassie, from Cassandra Rose, a template in Microsoft Word. And that template is designed for you to take some notes. You'll remember back in January when we were all together up in Augusta, and I said, take a piece of paper and draw a line and take some notes about the things that you don't want to forget and some questions you have. You're going to have in your email right now a template just like that in Microsoft Word to help you over today and tomorrow. Write down the things that you don't want to forget that you're hearing, particularly around these presentations, but you can put anything on there. So we urge you to use that Microsoft Word template that's showing up in your email. And then I'm going to ask Sophia to drop into the chat right now, just to the panelists, a Google Doc. In this Google Doc, what it allows you to do is to cut and paste some portion of what you're writing to yourself and share it with your other council members. And for folks who are observing us today, we have 408 observers on the line right now. After this meeting, we'll make that document public, the Google Doc. For now, it's just going to be for the council members to be working on. But council members, if you click on that link that's in the chat that went to you right now, that is an opportunity for you to take some of your own notes and let your colleagues see them, right? Please don't do a paragraph dump in there. Put some phrases, some thoughts, some ideas that from your own notes. You can just cut and paste quickly into the Google Doc. And that way we can see what's striking. And we can do that, and we'll also have Q&A towards the end of our meeting today, but allows us to do the 3 presentations back to back, and we won't do Q&A between them. Okay, so our process today is 3 presentations back to back. We have rehearsed them, so they should be at 20 minutes each. And then afterwards, we're going to have a panel of the co-chairs to have a slightly more informal conversation about the co-chairs' key takeaways from all this. And then we'll do a Q&A after that. I'm going to turn you over to the co-chairs of the buildings group and allow them to introduce themselves and to walk us through our first presentation from a working group.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. And I have the honor of co-chairing the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group, along with Michael Stoddard, the Executive Director of the Efficiency Maine Trust. Our working group was charged with developing, analyzing, and recommending strategies to reduce emissions and support resilience in Maine buildings. We had a really terrific multidisciplinary group with members who brought varied experience and insights and dedicated many, many hours over the last 8 months or so. A huge thank you to all of you. Thanks to members of the public who participated, and a really special thanks to Anastasia Heidegger, who has staffed the working group and been absolutely essential to our process. Because we are such a diverse group, we started by building a shared knowledge base with monthly meetings on specific topics and frequent presentations from outside experts, and always incorporated really robust discussion and brainstorming. So we talked about how the concepts we were exploring together might become actionable recommendations for policies and programs that could help Maine meet our long-range carbon reduction objectives and benefit the state's people, businesses, and institutions. We didn't shy away from the costs that would be associated with these recommendations, but we always looked for ways to maximize the benefits while mitigating the costs, and especially for our most vulnerable communities. We took a really inclusive and collaborative approach to developing those recommendations. We invited working group members to share any and all ideas, and our hardworking team submitted more than 40 straw proposals. Many of those proposals reflect the independent collaboration of multiple group members. Some came from members of the public, and they're all included in the appendix to our report. I'm going to hand it over to Michael and the next slide.
Thank you, Kathleen. Our work group was the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Work Group, and so we are focusing mostly on mitigation opportunities in the state. How can we as a state reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from the perspective of the users of energy? So the folks who live in homes, you see 19% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions are coming from our residential homes, 11% from commercial buildings, and 9% from industrial sources like factories, paper mills, sawmills, and the like. So that's where we were focusing our efforts. And we were considering where the sources are coming from within these buildings, as well as the energy systems that are supplying energy to these buildings. This is just an image of a residential home, and it helps visualize some of the things we were looking at to think about where the greenhouse gases are coming from. What are the sources? Where exactly are they in our homes? And you can imagine that it's comparable in our businesses as well. And it's primarily coming from the energy that we use in those buildings. So you can see here that we have space heating and air conditioning. We have water heating in that cylindrical unit down in the basement. We have electric appliances and lighting throughout the house. And so we thought about ways, and we looked at ways that you could mitigate the emissions from those sources. Options like using less energy by improving the energy efficiency of those appliances, or of course, weatherizing the shell of the building. You see the insulation up in the attic there. We could shift to cleaner fuels. If we're using a dirty kind of fuel that has a high carbon content, maybe we could shift to one that has lower carbon. Heat pumps are an example of a cleaner and a more efficient heating system. So there was a lot of talk about heat pumps, but also other kinds of heating systems, like you see modern wood heat in this picture here. And you see geothermal as an example down in the basement. So this is an imaginary home that has lots of heating systems, but that's actually representative of many homes in Maine as well. And finally, I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention how we're thinking about the future of Maine homes and businesses where they would be grid interactive. So you see here a solar panel on the roof, and you see a car down on the side, which is charging up. So these are all things that we were looking at in our work group. And let's talk now about the 6 strategies that we came up with to talk about these opportunities. So I'll just mention, we broke it, all the 40 different proposals that we received into 6 categories. The first one is about new construction in new buildings. The second one is about heating systems and cooling systems that go into those buildings, as well as not just new buildings, but also existing buildings. The third strategy relates to the existing building stock in Maine, and particularly the building envelope, or what sometimes is referred to as the shell of the building. The fourth strategy is a collection of sort of the best hits from those strategies that we think maybe could be some of the first steps Maine would take to more aggressively move in these directions, and taking advantage of publicly funded buildings to lead by example. The fifth strategy relates to the industrial sector, and the sixth strategy relates to how we need to modernize and optimize the size of our electric grid to accommodate some of the strategies we described. Kathleen, back to you.
Thanks, Michael. Strategy 1 is to improve the design and construction of new buildings. And we started with new construction because there is just so much potential to do better, to improve energy efficiency and resilience from the very beginning, to incorporate clean energy and low carbon building materials, and to make new Maine buildings net zero. So they use only as much energy as they generate, either on-site through rooftop solar, for example, or off-site. Now, it's possible to achieve those goals in existing buildings, and we'll get to that strategy in just a moment, but it's just so much more cost-effective to build them in the first place. It's the old ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure thing. So our working group recommends that Maine develop a roadmap to reach net zero emission building codes by 2035. Building codes set the standards for building design and construction, safety and performance, and they tend to be developed by an independent council with significant stakeholder input and then adopted by states, including Maine. They're really our best tool for protecting life safety, ensuring consumer protections, and moving the market toward best practices. But that process doesn't end when we adopt strong codes. So our working group also recommends committing the training and resources necessary to support code compliance. That training will carry some modest annual costs, but the additional expense of building a net zero home will be more than offset by the lower lifetime energy costs. And that's before we even consider the climate benefits. So for example, we've got some modeling that shows that a new net zero home in Bangor would save the equivalent of more than 500 gallons of heating oil a year and reduce carbon emissions at a savings of 8 cents per pound. So that's pretty impressive. Michael, back to you for the next strategy.
Thanks, Kathleen. So this was the strategy where we looked at the heating systems that we're using in our homes and buildings. And one of the starting points for us was to get a better understanding of how the carbon emissions vary from one heating type to another and from one heating fuel to another. This is just an illustration you see on the right here of one comparison. You have in the blue bar an average existing oil boiler in Maine. 62% of the heating that we get in Maine now comes from oil boilers and furnaces. The orange bar in the middle is what a more efficient high efficiency modern oil boiler or furnace would typically generate. And we compared that in this case to a high performance heat pump, which is the gray bar on the right. And so you can see the carbon emissions profile from these three choices is quite dramatic. And if we could shift from what we use now to more efficient and high performing heat pumps, we would achieve that kind of a greenhouse gas savings with each unit. Obviously, heat pumps are not the only choice. This is just the one we illustrated here, but there was a lot of discussion around higher performing natural gas heating, modern wood heating, and also renewable fuels like renewable natural gas and renewable oils. So the question is, how can we accelerate this transition to cleaner heating systems? Well, number one, we talked about expanding and extending the financial incentive programs that we have in the state to promote the purchase of higher performing and lower carbon units, and then ultimately shifting to more of a regulatory approach where at some point in the future, maybe starting in 2030, we make a regulation that sets minimum requirements for greenhouse gas performance, so that since new heating systems burn out about every 20 to 25 years, when it's time to replace that over the next 20 to 25 years, people are getting very low carbon emitting heating systems. So we talked about incentives, we talked about regulatory regime, and we also talked about developing mechanical licensing standards so that there is good quality assurance when people are having new technology installed, that the equipment will work well and be serviced well. We're lucky in Maine, there's a universe of many qualified small businesses that can perform these services now, so we just need to keep that up. This is some modeling that was done by Hannah Pingree's office to show what might happen under a couple of different scenarios of switching to these lower carbon fuels. On the left graph, you see what the fuel mix would be if we shifted to one of the three scenarios, what we call the hybrid heating scenario, where 2/3 of the heating load in Maine is provided by heat pumps, electrical sources, and another 1/3 is coming from renewable gases and fuels. So the green bar on top is the electricity increasing over time. The orange bar below that is wood heat. Then you see the natural gas converting to more renewable natural gas. And you see in the blue on the bottom is conventional heating oil declining over the next 30 years and somewhat being replaced by some amount of renewable heating fuels. What you get if you do that is shown on the right side. The blue bar at the top is business as usual if we made no changes, but the three lines below it show the various scenarios of either going all electric or electric with some increased weatherization, or electric plus a blend of renewable gases and fuels. And it just is really impressive to see that if we could push forward with this, just looking at these cleaner fuel sources, we could see an 80% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions.
Our third strategy is to improve the efficiency and resiliency of existing building envelopes. And this strategy really acknowledges that even as we approach net zero building codes for new construction, we have a tremendous amount of work to do in Maine's existing buildings. As we air seal and insulate Maine homes, we make them more comfortable, we lower their heating and cooling costs, and we reduce their energy consumption and carbon emissions. And the good news is that we know how to do this. In the last decade, Maine has weatherized more than 20,000 homes through Efficiency Maine programs, and we've improved many thousands more through the low-income programs of Maine Housing and the Community Action programs. Our working group recommends expanding those existing weatherization programs for homeowners of all income levels, and ensuring that the programs meet the needs of low-income Mainers, including those who rent rather than own their homes. In order to make the same kind of gains in commercial buildings and for commercial tenants, we recommend adopting requirements that commercial buildings disclose their energy usage. This kind of policy has been implemented in a number of places, and it has a kind of positive peer pressure effect, holding building owners accountable and supporting continuous efficiency improvements. At its core, this third strategy challenges us to scale up already successful programs. But there's also room to do a little bit more. We could link weatherization to load management programs that use existing and emerging technologies to balance the demand on the electric grid. We could start a clean energy corps that leverages volunteer and entry-level workers to connect people to weatherization opportunities. We could create a deep energy retrofit pilot that systematizes the efficiency improvements that usually have to be highly individualized to each house. However we approach it, expanding access to weatherization programs, along with the transitions to cleaner heating and cooling systems and increasingly ambitious building codes, will help us over time make all Maine buildings more efficient and resilient. With strategy 4, we have the example to lead by example in publicly funded buildings. So we can accelerate our progress in buildings that are funded by us, Maine taxpayers. We recommend that the state embrace its leadership role and make the best decisions in new buildings and embrace the best practices for building systems, techniques, and materials. A quick word on building materials. Most of the time we focus on the energy that buildings use for heating and cooling and lighting, what's called operational carbon. But our working group spent some time learning about embodied carbon, the energy that is literally built in by our choices about building materials and techniques. There's some really intriguing projects, including in Maine, that use products like cross-laminated timber and wood fiber insulation, products that can be made in Maine with Maine natural resources and Maine workers. And we'd really like to see those projects and others like them showcased to expand awareness of and experience with emerging technologies. The thing that's really exciting about these lead by example policies is that they can transform the buildings that house our most vulnerable residents. So students in our K-12 schools, community colleges and universities, and low-income Mainers who live in affordable housing. So this is a chart from Vesta Housing, a Portland-based nonprofit affordable housing provider that has built a number of highly efficient developments and tracked data about them. There's a lot going on here, but if you look in the first line, you see that the initial cost of building a affordable housing unit that complies with current building codes is, that's the first line. And then the second line is the difference that passive design makes. That's one of the models for highly efficient construction. The more stringent standards do increase construction costs, so that's the first column. It's about $1 per square foot more to build to passive standards. But those standards also help you cut operating costs dramatically, almost in half, and reduce carbon emissions by an even greater percentage, nearly 60%. So this is really a win-win, providing low-income Mainers with access to highly efficient homes that are incredibly cost-effective and dramatically reducing emissions. Michael, I will hand it back to you.
We're coming up to the finish line here. Strategy 5 relates to our discussions about the industrial sector. And we had two high-level recommendations here. One was to continue and expand the successful programs that have been working in recent years, where the entities like Efficiency Maine are partnering with Maine's large industrial users. They're doing really impressive projects to improve their energy efficiency and convert their fuel sources to lower carbon fuels. Back pressure steam turbine is what you see was done here at the Hancock Sawmill in Bethel. There's an opportunity to do more of that work in Maine, but the funding is somewhat limited at this time. So one of the recommendations was to look at whether we could do more funding there and whether we could expand into other areas. But combined heat and power seems like a promising opportunity. The other is more fuel switching. And to be candid, because of the unique and unusual kinds of uses that industrials have for fuels, it's not so easy to convert them over to electricity like it might be for space heating in your home or your office. And we ultimately concluded that this just needed more work. This needs more study. We need some breakthroughs in the commercialization of fuels. And we think that Maine it's very important. Clearly, we want to be competitive in this area, but we also want to meet our greenhouse gas targets. So we really need something like a task force, an industrial task force, to keep looking at this issue. The last strategy, number 6, is fundamental to all the other things we talked about. If we're going to have significant electrification of heating and also transportation, we're going to need a more robust grid, a power grid, and we're going to need to be able to use it in, it's going to have to be more nimble, and we're going to have the ability to manage load on that in real time. I know that this is something that the energy work group, who you'll hear from coming up, spent a lot of time talking about, so I won't belabor it here, but we had quite a bit of discussion around beneficial electrification and how this is going to put some increased focus on what our grid looks like and how we build it out in this state. So it's got to be a huge priority for us over the next decade or two. And to wrap it up, we just wanted to summarize what we think we would get if we could pursue these strategies. This is what came out of our work group. You know, you get increased energy independence. It means we're less vulnerable to the potential price swings and supply shortages from imported fuels. You have better buildings. They're more comfortable. They cost less to operate. They're healthier. You don't have as much combustion going on inside them. And they're more resilient to extreme weather. You have a modern, right-sized grid, and ultimately you have a more sustainable economy, and you have more economic development. So we think that that's a pretty positive story, and we're looking forward to see how this fits in with the rest of the work groups and to working with the Climate Council as they consider these proposals. Thanks everybody so much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael and Kathleen. Fantastic. Okay. So that's the buildings working group. Thanks, everybody. I see some folks have been posting some things on that Google Doc. Feel free to cut and paste some of your own notes into that. We're going to make a quick transition right into our next group, which is the transportation group. And I'll turn it over to the co-chairs of the transportation group to go ahead and introduce yourselves and get us going.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Joyce Taylor. I'm the Chief Engineer of Maine DOT. Sarah Cushman, who owns her own consulting transportation business, and I co-chaired the Transportation Working Group. And I would like to thank my team at DOT, who really did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the writing. Those of you on the council received our really detailed strategies that are a lot to absorb, and they really assisted with that. So thank you, guys. We had a very diverse group of folks that joined us, and we had a lot of observers from day one, but most of these people, really everyone kind of hung in there. We had meetings almost every week, it seemed like, at some point from March on, and a number of meetings in May. So I really appreciate everyone's time. People put in unbelievable amount of hours on this. So thank you. So our working group process, we really had that robust participation. We always had observers day one showing up. We allowed folks who were observers as guests to speak at the end of the meeting so we could hear their thoughts. And we had many more people when we started doing Zoom calls joining in. We had broken into 3 subgroups. It became clear that there were some really unique challenges for rural Maine and transportation that were a little bit different than suburban, urban Maine, and then basically heavy and medium truck fleets and looking at the truck contributions. So we did have those subgroups for a while, and then we came back as a whole group to continue talking about strategies. We had a lot of public comments, not even really including all the chat comments that we had from some of our different meetings. We held 3 stakeholder groups, marine, rural, urban, suburban, and we had really good participation. We, if you think about transportation, we're 54% of the emissions pie. Sarah's going to bring your attention to that on the next slide. And we chose early on to really focus in on vehicles and the vehicle emission because it's the vast majority of that transportation sector pie. But there was a lot of interest in marine. There's just been a lot of interest in electric ferries, all kinds of things. So we felt it was important to sort of meet with those folks, to acknowledge that there was interest in that topic, and to bring it forward to the Climate Council at a later date. I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Cushman.
Morning, everybody. God love you for spending this much of your time since September and again over the next couple of days. So thank you so much for that. So yeah, we've known for years that transportation is maybe the hardest nut for us to crack. And as Joyce pointed out, we're the majority of the pie. And unlike other sectors like the residential sector, electric power sector, that have made some real gains in recent years in reducing emissions, our emissions have actually only grown a little bit more over time. So you can see the average Maine vehicle. Joyce is right, 59% of our transportation emissions are passenger car and truck trips. And many of us, our primary vehicle drives way more than 12,000 miles a year, of course. And then we also host 37 million guests every year in the state, and most of those folks travel by private vehicle. So yeah, we broke into those subgroups, recognizing that Maine is primarily a rural state, and a lot of our miles are rural miles, trying to really address those different sub-contexts. And then of course, also looking at adaptation, which is not just a coastal issue, right? Of course, sea level rise is huge, but so is flooding, including river flooding across the state. We're all experiencing extreme weather events and increased temperatures, and then precipitation of all kinds is wreaking havoc on our transportation infrastructure. So there was a real hunger from the very start of our process for Maine-specific data to help us in thinking through our strategies. And thanks to the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Transportation and Efficiency Maine Trust and some other folks, and also local data that's collected nationally, like census data, we were able to put together some initial scenarios to try to help us vet through things that we were looking at for options. And then, as Michael mentioned in the housing presentation, the state's consultant, Synapse, helped with some decarbonization modeling that you'll see. So these two graphs, the graph on the left, as Michael pointed out, the blue line is the business as usual line. So this is emissions related. And the initial scenarios that they ran were very heavy on the electrification side of things, right? So electric vehicles. And a number of our group members were concerned about the feasibility. For example, 90% adoption rate of EVs by 2050. We also, I think as a group, carried some questions about how reducing vehicle miles traveled could impact things. And so we asked for that green line, T3 was the third scenario, involved very ambitious and also feasible reduction in vehicle miles traveled, which you can see helps us get to our 2030 target. So not just getting to 2050, but 2030 as well. And then on the right side graph, this is about electricity consumption by the transportation sector. And so again, I draw your eye to that T3 line, and it's with that emphasis also, it's a full mix, right, with electrification and fuel efficiency and everything that's in the listed in that left sidebar. It's really tremendously, significantly lowers the burden that we would put on the grid too in that scenario. So I think folks have spoken really eloquently today to the ties between the pandemic and the climate crises and equity, deep equity concerns that all of those things expose. And our strategies definitely are looking also at that synergy side of things, right? How can we leverage our economic recovery to also make Maine stronger and more climate resilient? And you know, it's very obvious that jobs are created when we talk about things like building more charging infrastructure and expanding broadband and adapting our physical on the ground transportation infrastructure. But our strategies also include how do we get folks to jobs and ways that actually increase access to those places of employment, which we hear from employers, whether you're in Limestone or Scarborough, that's a huge issue. And I think we can never forget on the household level that Mainers spend 30% on average of their income on transportation. And for those of us who are in lower income households, it's closer to 40%. And so it's nothing to sneeze at when we talk about strategies that really save Mainers on fuel and maintenance and vehicle purchase costs. And there are some real quick wins, and I think the pandemic really ties in with that too and has shown us some of those things. We'll talk more about broadband, which I think is on every stakeholder's mind across the spectrum. But things as simple as, can I take a safe walk? Maybe it's a decent shoulder on the rural road that I grew up on. Maybe it's a sidewalk in a village area. Those things are quick wins and also really critically important. Back to Joyce.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to talk about these 5 strategies. There's a lot of detail behind them that we don't have time to talk about today that are in our full write-ups. But I think to Dr. Shaw's point, the first 3, expand electrification, reduce emissions, reduce vehicle miles, really get to personal choice and behavior. And that's really when you talk about the transportation strategies. This is a lot of personal behavior. And it impacts every person in Maine. And it's really fundamental to how we get anywhere. So it's really something that people have a lot of interest in. So we had a lot of conversation, and I think, frankly, out of all of our strategies, this had the pretty widespread agreement about expanding the electrification of transportation. Obviously, this is cross-cutting with the buildings group and the energy group as well, but really to increase the electrical vehicle adoption to achieve the electrification and emission reduction goals. So some of this work has been ongoing. This first bullet, to design comprehensive and consistent approach to monitoring and overseeing electrification efforts and expanding the EV charging infrastructure. Efficiency Maine has done a great job with some of the Volkswagen money to start this effort. But there's a lot of people, private business, public buildings, for example, that do have electrification, the ability for people to charge, and just trying to figure out where all this is, and to be able to help people understand who might have range anxiety about buying an electric vehicle, that they really do have possibilities and options. We still have more work to do in terms of places of work and apartment buildings, things like that, where people share parking lots, and to be able to bring more infrastructure for the charging system there. And I think we spent a lot of time about, we really need to know where we want to go. Sometimes it's a little piecemeal right now. So we talked about a comprehensive EV expansion study to build off some of the work that's already been done, so that we make good financial choices about where we need to go further. We had a lot of talk about equity. There's no doubt that today's stock that's available here in Maine, these are cars that are expensive, and the average Mainer may not consider buying them right now. We have a lot of older vehicles in this state. People drive those vehicles longer typically than in other states. So I think the electric vehicle, we need to find a way to really look at, low income and rural drivers. Electrification is really important for the rural Mainer. This could be one of the best strategies for them. We did talk about electric bikes. They've come a long way, and they could be a really great option for some people. One thing I would say, being in the transportation industry, I've been working on autonomous vehicles and the rulemaking for Maine and the use of those. There is no doubt in my mind that the manufacturers are driving electrification because of the autonomous technology. So I think this is a more doable strategy than maybe some people believe.
So our second broad strategy is addressing the fact that the vast majority of our current fleet are vehicles on the road are internal combustion engine driven. And so how can we increase their efficiency? And we talked about a whole range of strategies, and they're all still in our packet. You can sort through them, including behavior change on the sort of household level. Two areas of emphasis we really wanted to bring to the council's attention are encouraging companies to voluntarily, and this came out of our medium and heavy duty trucking group, encouraging companies to voluntarily participate in US EPA's Smart Way program. So that's a program that helps improve fleet freight efficiency specifically, and is pretty impressive. The other area of emphasis was around expanding alternative fuels. So for example, leveraging the current waste oil to biodiesel production in the state, that both the manufacturing and then also distribution that gets that everywhere in the state that it needs to go. The third broad strategy that we wanted to offer you is looking at how do we enable folks to be able to drive less? And also how do we address the needs of many Mainers who can't drive at all? And so much of this comes back to how we support private investment and also public investment in places where people can walk and bike and take the bus. So thinking about our rural crossroads and our neighborhoods and our village areas and urban centers too. And teleservices, I think none of us at the table, or a few of us, saw it of how high that would rise to the top in terms of our areas of emphasis. And our eyes really have been opened. For example, on our rural stakeholder call, a stakeholder from Washington County shared how he could never have imagined his employees all working from home, and yet they had made that transition. And he said, you know, I've noticed for years, I've been watching work dry up at the local level and folks having to travel further and further for jobs. And now I've got my employees are back in their hometowns. They're there day to day, every day. They're able to enlist to help out with the volunteer fire department. There's a community building co-benefit and ramification. It's sort of a rebirth of a new form of community and work. And then, so transit in Maine is fairly underfunded compared to other similar jurisdictions. And so we spent quite a bit of time thinking about how could we build capacity there, and including in, for our existing transit networks, but also how do we take another look at, and I loved Dr. Shaw's reminder that everything from Mandela, that everything is impossible until it happens. I think so many of us have looked at things, this is an example, the large yellow school bus, right, which might be traveling with just a handful of kids now in a particular town with quite a bit of municipal investment in that resource. And how could we rethink that and use our Yankee ingenuity and the particular context of the world as it is right now, and maybe we swap out that big yellow school bus for an accessible van, for example, that takes those kids still to school morning and afternoon, but the rest of the time is available for trips to work, for trips for seniors with disabilities to services. It's something that I think many of us think, oh, we've looked at that before and there's all these barriers, it's impossible, but what could be done now?
So we also did talk about adaptation. And I think, you don't have to look much further than Vermont when they were hit with Tropical Storm Irene, and they had whole counties of roads and bridges wiped out and left people completely stranded for weeks until emergency services could get to them. So we said and I think we had a lot of agreement around this strategy as well, to adapt to increase resiliency because of climate change. And we think we need to do a statewide infrastructure vulnerability assessment. There are a lot of people who've done pieces of this and pieces and parts of this work, and we're talking about trying to bring it all together. For example, DOT has a lot of information on its specific assets, but there's nowhere where you can see municipal assets at the same time as state assets. much less what are the other important infrastructures like sewer system, water treatment plants, hospitals, those critical infrastructure services, putting that in one place, and to consider improvements with resilient and green infrastructure replacement. There are materials available now that can withstand more storm surge and different things that we can look at in terms of what we use, and then to create a plan to address vulnerabilities. And I think what's important on this one is to note that, we could raise a bridge 8 feet high, but if the village around it's going to be completely underwater, or everyone's driveways get impacted because we raise a road 8 feet high, it really acts as a system. You can't just fix one thing. You have to really look at that geographic area as a system. And the other thing I would just share is every DOT in the country has to do a transportation asset management plan, and we have to identify risk. I think it's really interesting. You might not think of DOTs as being environmental stewards, but every DOT listed climate as a risk. And I think that speaks to the depth of this issue. And if you're in Arizona, it might be a dust storm causing you to not have visibility. Here in Maine, it could be these frequent large storms we have. So I just find that interesting and thought I'd share it with you. So we also talked about exploring mechanisms to fund transportation needs and facilitate emissions reductions. While our charge was not to solve the transportation funding problem, there's no doubt it's been chronically underfunded, and traditional funding is not enough to fund the climate strategies. It really does make these two things somewhat intertwined. I think our working group, we agreed that funding for transportation is needed and that there are a variety of options available, but we could not agree on any single funding mechanism. We did think that future discussions about funding transportation should include the consideration of emissions reductions. One thing I would like to end on to share with the Climate Council, we are willing as a group to continue working through this summer and to support you and to help evaluate the cost-benefit information that's coming. And we would be more than happy to do that and to give you more information if you so desire. So thank you for paying attention and listening to us, and we're happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic. Wow. Let's do a quick pivot to our final presentation of the day. So let me turn it over to the co-chairs of the Energy Working Group to walk us through this final presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, David. My name is Dan Burgess, and I'm the director of the Governor's Energy Office and co-chair of the Energy Working Group. I'll let Ken introduce himself.
Sure. Ken Colburn here, but in front of the mountains. And I'm a former environmental regulator who for the last 10 years has been working with public utility commissions across the country with the Regulatory Assistance Project and assisting them in implementing clean energy opportunities. I retired in March from the Regulatory Assistance Project, which is good because that has given me more time to work on the Maine Climate Council work. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Ken, and we appreciate the timing of your retirement as you jumped into this full time and you're able to work on this. So the Energy Working Group is going last today, I think, because there is so much overlap and coordination that is needed with the buildings group and the transportation group. And I think you'll hear similar themes and similar objectives. The mission of our group was to develop, analyze, and recommend strategies to the Climate Council to mitigate emissions from and adapt to the impacts of climate change in Maine's energy sector, specifically electricity generation and delivery, as well as thermal supply and delivery. And so what we're going to talk through today is, and think about, is as the electricity sector is undergoing really, and the energy sector is undergoing a transformation, and as Maine considers our energy future, what policies are needed to ensure that we're meeting changing or growing demand, embracing new technologies and ways of thinking, and the like. So before we jump into the recommendations, we thought it was important to give just a very brief overview for those of you that are not on the Energy Working Group or don't think about energy issues every day. Maine is part of a regional electricity grid managed by ISO New England, a regional system operator. And this chart before you shows the generation by fuel source across the region. Just a couple important trends to think about as we think about our energy future. Maine has a cleaner generation resource than this, but because we're part of a regional grid, it's important to highlight. Over on the left is the year 2000, and over to the right is 2019. And you can really see a transformation in the region away from coal and oil electricity generation over the last 20 years, and an increase in reliance on natural gas generation, as well as a few others. Many reasons for that. The regional greenhouse gas initiative that we're a part of, the age of some of those coal and oil, more traditional older plants, and then market dynamics with advent of fracking. I thought it was important to give this background before jumping into our strategies and recommendations. Also important to note here, as Michael talked about, is that, as we think about our home heating sectors, that Maine is reliant on fuel oil, with 60% of our home heating coming from fuel oil, 11% from propane, and you can see the other categories there. And if you look next, you'll see that Maine is actually the most heating oil dependent state in the country. We are that green triangle on the top right, and the other orange boxes are the other New England states. And so there's clearly an opportunity to think about our home heating system using lower carbon fuels, as Michael talked about and Kathleen talked about, and we'll have a little bit more on that. It's also important to highlight that Maine has made significant progress over the last year and a half. And on the left-hand side, you can see that Maine has passed and has one of the most ambitious renewable portfolio standards in the country. A renewable portfolio standard is a requirement that a certain percentage of our electricity come from renewable resources. After 2017, Maine's renewable portfolio standard was at 40%. Last legislative session, a bill was passed to increase that to 80% by 2030 and a goal of 100% by 2050. So Maine is already on a pathway to embrace and achieve an 80% of our electricity coming from renewable resources over the next 10 years. And if you look at that chart on the bottom left, that is the most ambitious in New England. On the right, you can also see that we are, as a result of legislation and programming, seeing really significant growth in distributed generation. So that's projects as defined right now as under 5 megawatts. And currently there are about 65 megawatts, probably more like 80 once you count it, but there are over 2,000 megawatts of proposed projects in the pipeline, and not all those will come online over the next few years, but there is a significant amount of project development happening in the distributed generation space. So we wanted to make sure to give that context, and it's something that our working group talked about, is there is already significant movement happening in the electricity sector, in particular, as we look to embrace more renewable energy.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan's indicated, and some of the charts from the buildings and transportation work groups as well, Maine's starting in a pretty good place already, and we stand to have even greater opportunity going forward by pursuing a clean energy economy, because growing those clean energy resources and technologies affects our entire economy. First out of the gate, and perhaps most obvious, is job creation. That's well documented, and I'll show you a graph in a minute. In the country, there's more than 3 times the amount of clean energy jobs now operating than there are in the fossil side of the economy. And enlisting and boosting Maine's can-do spirit, as was also mentioned by the earlier work groups, will help drive solutions that will further that process in Maine to its economic benefit. Perhaps most important, which they also alluded to, but perhaps didn't make as crystal clear, is that we don't have the ability to generate our own oil to use home heating oil in our economy. We do have the ability to generate our own electricity to heat homes with heat pumps. So keeping our energy dollars at home is a way of keeping that money working in Maine's economy instead of sending it off to other states. It won't be all a bed of roses. Many people in the fossil fuel industry now may find their jobs at risk. So we have to work on a just transition. And then there are the equity issues that were well put forward by the buildings and transportation groups that we also need to address and offer assistance to. This is global renewable energy deployment, and you can see how rapidly it has grown over the last 6 years, up 51%. And the news is actually better than that, is that the wage rates of those jobs are also well above US averages. Clean energy production jobs are about almost 20% higher than the US average wage. So there's a nice oasis here to get to, and that's what our recommendations and those of our colleague working groups are for. We did several level setting presentations from the ISO New England regional grid. We also had a presentation by Dr. Richard Silkman on a possible pathway to a lower zero economy power sector in Maine. We also had a presentation by Advanced Energy Economy about a number of new technologies, opportunities that could be applied in Maine. In addition, we heard from the gas folks, both describing the New England natural gas system and also from the National Renewable Energy Lab about what might be done in producing gas from renewable energy as well going into the future. And then finally, we also talked about biomass, wood energy, and CHP, as has also been mentioned. That occurred in 10 meetings of the Energy Working Group, and many of those meetings were half-day or nearly full-day meetings, a real dedication on the part of the work group members, and smaller group efforts to develop the specific recommendations also numbered 10 or more efforts as well. We were pleased and blessed to have several members of the public attend all of our in-person meetings and I think also all of our subsequent Zoom meetings. So that was a very active contingent, and we appreciate the input from those members of the public. Our own working group, of course, represented a broad array of energy knowledge across the state and contributed throughout the process. And then finally, we also had public input from other sources as well that kind of came in over the transom, but Cassie and Sarah made sure that that got to the Energy Working Group. So it was quite a process, and just express Dan and my gratitude to you all, the 30 people involved there. And not listed here is Melissa Winnie, who has staffed us so capably throughout. This group came up with 54 straw proposals to start with, and it took some effort to consolidate and winnow them down to the 5 that you have today that Dan will describe now.
Thanks, Ken. So there are 5 overarching recommendations that we are going to run through. As Ken mentioned, the theme that I think Ken and I want to highlight through all this, which has come up today, is the opportunity for all of these initiatives to consider and prioritize equity, workforce and just transition, embracing innovation, and advancing the clean energy economy. Clearly, it's been a theme throughout the morning, and I think our group felt like those were themes that would come throughout this. So our 5 recommendations are as follows, and we'll run through them, but is ensuring that as Maine has its ambitious RPS goal, that we have policies in place that ensure that we can meet that in an affordable manner, to initiate a power sector transformation process to run through some of the more detailed and necessary issues that modernizing our energy system requires, encouraging combined heat and power, instituting a renewable fuel standard, and developing additional financing options to help meet our ambitious clean energy targets. So the first recommendation is about meeting our ambitious renewable portfolio standards. So again, our RPS is 80% by 2030 and a goal of 100% by 2050. Embedded within that is a long-term contract opportunity. It's actually Maine's largest clean energy procurement that's ever been done, is currently moving forward right now through the summer that the Public Utilities Commission is running. There's another procurement slated to run after that by at least January of next year. And our group felt that it was important to ensure that future sources could be brought on and that there was a signal to the development community that the Maine's market would continue to grow, that there be additional procurements put in place, particularly another one by 2022. My office is slated to conduct a study over the remainder of the year that will help inform this, but we felt like 2022 could also benefit from additional procurement. We felt that targets should be developed for offshore wind, distributed energy resources, and new technologies like energy storage. There was an energy storage commission conducted by the legislature, which had some very strong recommendations that our group considered. And then just a note on offshore wind is that the map you see there on the bottom right is the wind speed resource map for the United States. And you can see that Maine has one of the best wind speed resources in the country. So there's a significant opportunity for offshore wind. But I think that dovetails into the third bullet here, is that any renewable energy development has to give thoughtful and careful consideration to the siting and that process, and that there needs to be a full public engagement process with that. And so we felt like it was important to ensure that Maine DEP has the staffing funds that it needs to ensure that process can be thorough and timely, but that also that there should be, especially with offshore wind, early engagement to seek to minimize impacts on existing users and the environment.
Our second recommended strategy was to initiate a power sector transformation stakeholder process. Those of you who carefully observed the buildings and transportation presentations are surely noting by now that the use of electricity in those sectors is dramatically up, indeed, perhaps even dependent on electricity. And in order to accomplish that, then we're going to need a whole lot more power. Specifically, how much, though, is a big question, because the entire power sector is up in the air right now. The grid as a whole can already carry twice as much power as we use if we used it more intelligently, but we may need 3 or 4 times as much power depending on how we implement. So the question isn't just how big we need to build our future grid, because building is expensive, but how we approach it. Will we use more DERs that don't get paid for by utility ratepayers, but are paid for by homeowners and businesses, for example? And what sort of rates will encourage what sort of behaviors in terms of the timing of the use of the grid, which is a big issue. You know, in short, for 100 years, we've managed the supply of electricity to users to match their demand at any given moment. And now going forward, we'll have renewable energy available and storage opportunities. So we'll have to manage the demand of electricity more to meet when those renewables are available and what storage resources we have to help supply them. So that's what this recommendation seeks to address. I mentioned that almost everything is up in the air in the blue box. We suggest that we look at the utility business model, how utilities are structured, the load management side, how can we be more flexible with how the grid is managed, and the demand side particularly. That's going to require a lot of data and information, including widespread to some new parties that are not used to it. Many non-wires alternatives, like non-generation alternatives, will also exist through greater efficiency and through distributed energy resources. How the costs for what we do end up building get allocated is another critical issue related to the equity concerns that were mentioned earlier. And as Dan mentioned, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're part of a regional grid that has both blessings and curses. Blessings are in costs and reliability. Curses are in the ability to go our own way anytime we want, however we want, because we're part of this larger whole. So at the end of the day, what changes in regulation and law may be necessary? So this power sector transformation process, closely related to the last recommendation of the buildings group, would target the transformation of and planning for Maine's electric sector to achieve a clean energy economy and Maine's greenhouse gas reductions. Obviously, there's no direct carbon reductions associated with such a process, but it's essential to ensure that beneficial electrification for the buildings and transportation can be implemented and climate goals can be achieved in the most effective and efficient ways and at least cost. Thanks. Dan, back to you for number 3.
Strategy number 3 is around encouraging the utilization of combined heat and power, and particularly using similar long-term contracting mechanisms to increase utilization of CHP. This was talked about in the buildings group. Combined heat and power is a type of distributed generation resource that is co-located next to a user. So this CHP produces both electricity and then useful thermal heat at the same time. And so there's an opportunity here to increase the amount of CHP that is developed in the state. And again, reducing energy waste and potential energy costs that come with new development, or would come with these less efficient resources. Strategy number 4, again, is to institute a renewable fuel standard, which would again be the required percentage of renewable fuels that come from a lower carbon resource. The group is not necessarily comfortable with setting the specific parameters of how this would be structured, but thought that there should be a stakeholder group to determine the categories, the tiers, initial percentages, and then also felt like it was an opportunity to create pilot programs to look at potential of both renewable natural gas, but also power to gas, and creating hydrogen using potentially excess renewable energy. So this was a strategy that we felt like had promise, but we felt like there needed to be some of the details worked out through additional work. And I'll pass it over to Ken for the last strategy.
Thank you, Dan. And on this one, this is going to take some money, of course. Transportation raised that point clearly as well. So one of our strategies is then to develop and implement new financing options to meet our new clean energy economy and emission targets. The work group determined that there were a couple of options that we had that could be implemented relatively quickly. There were good precedents in other states and whatnot. And then there were some that needed some substantial additional investigation and study. So in that first category was the idea of a state green bank for Maine, and to increase revenue bonding, not only for the state, but also enable greater use of revenue bonding on the part of municipalities for pursuit of their own more local emission reduction goals. The green bank is described there in the blue box, but basically is a financing mechanism to help communities transition from fossil fuels. Both of those would require initial capitalization. There'd be challenges in that, but we've been there and done that kind of thing before, and many states have done both of these measures as well. So it's certainly not unbroken pathway. The other three options that we identified had a greater need for further investigation. And one of those was the consumer ownership and control of Maine's power delivery system. As many of you know, public money is typically available far more cheaply than money on financial markets to private borrowers. So we might be able to save substantial money if we used consumer-owned public monies as opposed to private money the way we do it now in building this new grid. And as a closely related part of that, some states also have a power authority, which is a semi-independent entity, which would serve as the primary energy planning and financing authority in the state. So we thought that was worth looking into as well. And then finally, we already have carbon pricing in the electric power system, and we should investigate how we could apply that to other raw energy resources, other fuels, and so forth, move that beyond just the electric power sector. However, we don't know that that would be a good move for Maine on a single state basis. So we would suggest that investigation focus on either a multi-state or a national approach and what we could do to move in that direction or be ready for it when it happens. Those are our 5 recommendations, and I think Dan and I and all of the members of the work group look forward to working with the council, helping however we can going forward this summer to flesh out the council's overall plans to recommend to the governor and legislature. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Dan. Fantastic. Okay, there you have it. 3 solid working group products that are ready for our analysis on the Climate Council. We're going to try something now, folks, which is we have as panelists the 6 co-chairs you just heard, as well as the 2 co-chairs of the Science and Technical Subcommittee that's been very helpful in making the scientific basis and analysis for this work. That's Ivan Fernandez and Robert Marvini. The idea behind this, and thanks for everyone for joining, is to try to have a more let's call it informal conversation about what's really important here. And I'm going to pose as a series of questions. We'll start with this first one. I'm going to put in the chat too, so everybody can see the question, remind ourselves. And the first question that I want to instigate a conversation on with the 8 of you is about an insight, right? What is an insight that you've had during this process that does 2 things for you? It gives you hope, right? But it also may not be particularly obvious to everybody else. Okay, so this is just more of the informal kind of conversation as opposed to we need to go down the list, everybody give your piece. But let me just open it up to say to anybody who would like to share on this particular issue of an insight you've had during this process that gives you hope and isn't necessarily obvious to everybody. I'll leave it open to anyone who wants to jump in.
So David, I would just add, I sort of mentioned it on the strategy, but I think it's not always believable. But electrification of vehicles is being driven by manufacturers, which means they really want to see it happen. And I think, especially in our rural stakeholder meeting, a lot of people were like, that's never going to happen. No one in Maine's ever going to do that. And I think they're coming out with a variety of vehicles. Anyone who watched Super Bowl probably saw some ads. And yeah, it's taken a little bit of a step back right now because of the pandemic, and they might not be investing the way they were, but they're still doing it. And I see articles on it every day. And so I think that's going to be something that's easier to do than the average person in the state might think.
That's great. Thanks, Joyce. Other reflections about insights?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on Joyce's point. We had that slide in the buildings work group presentation that showed the modeling of what the greenhouse gas reductions would be if we pursued a variety of scenarios to improve the efficiency of our buildings and do some fuel switching. And it showed that we could get to 80% reductions. Well, that is the target. I was part of a process like this 15 years ago in Maine. We did a climate action plan, and we didn't have commercially available technologies that we could model to show that how we might get to that goal. So we had to think about studies and more research and cross your fingers and hope something good happens. And here we are 15 years later. We have electric vehicles, which were not a thing 15 years ago, not in a commercially available, viable way. And we have heat pumps and heat pump water heaters that were not a thing that worked in cold climates 15 years ago. So, and we didn't have renewable energy available at the price competitiveness that it is now. So, and there are new developments coming along all the time that just give me hope that we now see ways that we could get to the goal line. And now we just got to put our minds to making that happen.
David, this is Ken. I'll hop on both of those. Not surprising with the insight that germinated perhaps before, but has really been brought home to me on the energy work group. And that is the increasing integration of energy, buildings, and transportation. You heard clearly the importance of electrification in buildings and transportation. Buildings even had a grid-related recommendation for the council. And then at the same time, we're seeing much more of energy being developed and generated at the buildings and transportation level, certainly on the building side. Charging of electric vehicles will be a critical element in terms of how the grid is used, which will be a critical element in terms of how much we need to build for a new grid, how much money we need to spend in that direction. So it's no longer the case, certainly, and will be even less so in the future, that you have your electric power system and your utilities, and they feed customers, and then customers do work with the power. It's much more integrated, and I think that's a good thing. A bit of a challenge to manage it all, but those are challenges that have been faced and overcome in the past, and this one will be too. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Ken, I think that's right. There's the one way to look at that these problems are so big and so integrated that we can't just solve them one at a time. That's the hard way to look at it. The really hopeful way to look at it is that we get so much bang for our buck in solving these problems because they have benefits in so many parts of our economy and so many places that people interact with them. You have a grid integrated, energy efficient building. That's a great place to live. It's a great place to charge your car. It's a great place to contribute energy that you've produced on your rooftop. That's really exciting.
Other insights?
David, I would just chime in. I think I have three that really echo some of what was just said. But we talk about costs when we talk about a response to climate change. But the costs are cost-effective costs, which means they're actually saving us money when we do the analysis. So we're not talking about actions that are just burning cash. We're talking about investments that pay back more than the cost of it. The second is that obviously COVID-19 has showed us how dramatically things can change when the right signals are in place. Now, COVID-19 is obviously a pretty horrible way to demonstrate that, but change happens fast. And hearkening to what Michael said, we know how to do this. Almost everything we're talking about is not inventing something brand new, but it's a matter of, we know how to bake the cake, it's just we're figuring out the recipe going forward. So I think there's a lot of reason for hope in that regard.
Just wanted to add one other thing, sort of tying in on the humanities side of things. We were 30 people on our working group. Every working group had maybe 30 people, and from very diverse work experiences and life experiences. And I feel like we had a capacity, most of us hadn't worked together. Joyce always reminds me, most of us hadn't worked together before. And it's that you grow that sense, you sort of witness over 9 months what people are willing, how folks are willing to listen to one another, to learn from one another, to grapple with tough things together. And so I always want to remember that one of our greatest assets is our own selves, right? We're, as Mainers, I think we have generations of experience with hardship too, that is really informs us as, you know, whether it's knowing how to be tight with a buck when we need to, or some Yankee ingenuity to figure out how do I get to work with one less car in the driveway. And it's none of that is sexy, right? Doing with a little less is never sexy, but yeah, it's just like Ivan said, we are learning what we are capable of. And I think we have a culture that really can support this change and in powerful ways, in ways that maybe we never understood or are beginning to realize it more and more.
I just want to pitch into what Ivan was saying. There are real costs happening right now that we're seeing right now in the infrastructure world because of sea level rise and more frequent storms. And I think that the good news is we've seen this for a while and we've started adapting already, you know, increasing the size of culverts and bridges and trying to raise roads where we can. But I think I was thinking, it was funny when you talked, Ivan, because that was exactly what I was thinking is, yes, it's a difficult lift to talk about money. It really is. And it couldn't be more hard than what we're feeling right now. But if you talk to folks from Vermont, I had family that lost houses and the money they had to spend as a state to get through that tropical storm. And it is significant economically, the hit to their economy at the time, the isolation people had. I mean, we haven't had a storm event like that in a really long time. And, you know, I think our day may be coming and, you know, we don't want to learn the hard way, but I think there's significant cost associated with these storm events that we need to keep reminding ourselves of when we talk about, you know, spending money on the strategies.
Anything else people want to share around sort of insights from this?
I guess I would just pile on to well, a couple of things. One was just the decades of experience that the 30 members and the members of the public brought to our group. Really was gave me hope. People have been grappling with similar issues like this for a long time, and I think people were willing to and excited to bring that expertise here. We didn't solve every issue. You know, there's a lot more work to be done on this, but people brought a lot to that throughout the process. And my other thing that I would note is just the opportunity for Maine to lead in innovation. And, you know, utilizing our natural resources to help move us forward in this, I think came through a lot in some of our discussion, whether it's, wood-based products, biofuels, offshore wind. We've got natural resources that can help us meet these challenges. And so I think it was a couple moments of, or opportunities of hope here.
That's great. Okay. So unless folks want to keep going on that thread, there's a second thread I wanted to prompt your conversation on, and that is hearkening back to how we started the day today. And what has been a shift, or what's the biggest shift you've had in your thinking since we've had this new reality of a pandemic? And I could add on to the end of that the coda of the other issues that we're really grappling with as a nation right now in terms of inequities and racial justice, right? So you could add a coda onto that question if you chose. But what has been a shift in thinking as you've come to terms with this new reality that's different than when you started back in January?
I think the telework is the obvious one. And I think, it was really kind of almost ironic because we struggled with studies that were saying that people who telework actually travel more. And so we had many a discussion about whether it even should be a strategy. But if you look at those studies, they're old, very, not many folks in the United States were teleworking really. And those who did were probably doing it because they lived in another state. So yeah, they were traveling more because they had to fly somewhere to their company or drive long distances. And I think with what we've learned today is, this telework model could really be a huge quick win out the door that doesn't cost the state any money. And so that is something that, I think is really interesting. And I was one of the ones who kept saying, you got to look at the data. The data is not showing that it's a good strategy, but I really think we've turned it upside down. It's very interesting.
I'm going to jump in on on that too. That's immediately what came to mind for me as well. And I think layered on top of that is what I've been hearing more and more from a real variety of folks about what their experience has been or was and has been sheltering in place and their day-to-day driving. And there's sort of a new understanding they've been coming to about what trips are necessary, what car trips are really fulfilling, and what are extraneous. And it's a blip, right? And it's this terrible, terrible experiment that we're living under. I always want to acknowledge that. And nothing about it is normal, but and all the forecasts are that we'll drive more than ever once the full threat of the virus is over. But I wonder, I guess I sit with that question, and it comes back to Dr. Shaw's point about behavior change, is what will we have internalized about our driving from this experience that might help us along this climate work that we're doing?
David, this is Ken. I would again pile on, I think, to that. The thing that the pandemic has brought home for me with climate change is their troubling complementarity. They reinforce each other. Dr. Shaw eloquently elaborated on a couple of those, but in the climate world, and Ivan could certainly elaborate on this further, we have what are called feedback loops. That the hotter things get, the more ice melts. The more ice melts, the more solar radiation is absorbed by the planet, so the more things warm up, so the more ice melts. And there's several examples of that. Several of them could be quite devastating. And I think what we have is a feedback loop with respect to the pandemic too, creating environments that are more amenable to disease outbreaks. Think in terms of how much more refrigeration and air conditioning would be necessary. Joyce mentioned culvert replacements. That requires tax dollars. Taxes are often fairly regressive, or at least not ideally progressive. That means the equity issues are not well served. There's a feedback loop negatively against the already disadvantaged. So there's as I say, a troubling complementarity here between climate change and the pandemic that hadn't been quite as clear to me in the past.
I think I would add the opportunity. Well, first of all, I think the how integrated our systems are and how we need to be thinking broadly and not just issue by issue, and how connected they are. Broadband, all those things, certainly impact all of our groups and all the things we need to be thinking about. But pandemic is also, I think, as we've talked about, really identified the challenges that those in our community face that we need to be thinking of at the forefront before, as we work on these policies. I think that, putting policies forward that don't include that would not be successful. Maybe we do hit our GHG goals, but if we're not lifting others up throughout and lifting our whole community up throughout, it's not, I wouldn't consider that successful. And I think I would also add we didn't talk about it, but the price of oil went negative during this. And I think it really highlighted for me the opportunity for Maine to take greater hold of our energy future through some of these investments and not be as reliant on some of the larger global systems that currently drive, energy prices, and so making those investments in Maine, creating jobs in Maine through new project development that helps meet these objectives, I think has really been spotlighted here for me.
I would add one of the observations I have that maybe we're all recognizing as a result of being in the midst of this pandemic is, and the social discussions around other issues, it feels like the community is more ready to discuss and accommodate some long-term planning and some big changes. And in a way that I just haven't felt in a couple of decades of bumping along and making little incremental tweaks here and there. In Maine, we've been working hard at making incremental improvements in our energy systems and our transportation systems, but it's hard work, and it's sometimes controversial, and sometimes there's investment that's required that's not easy for us to come up with as a state. And all that stuff still applies. It's still going to be hard. But one of the things that came out of these discussions that I noticed is there are some big, heavy lifts that do need to be made for us to scale this up. I mean, it's nice that some of these technologies are commercially available now in a way that they weren't 10 or 20 years ago. But it's still, to do it at the scale that we need to do it to meet these goals is quite dramatic. And there are a number of recommendations that I saw from each of the work groups to take a step back and study things and come up with a long-term plan. And you occasionally hear criticisms in Maine that there isn't some comprehensive plan for what we're intending to do for whether it's energy or transportation or greenhouse gases. And I think we find ourselves in this time and in this place where it's being called for. I think people are more open to it, and so I think that's the big thing that we might try to take advantage of here in my mind during the next 6 months in the Climate Council, to think about some very serious planning. Whether some of it the council can do itself, some of it can direct state agencies or other entities or task forces to do, but. And sometimes that's viewed as just kicking the can down the road. But in this case, I don't really think so. I think if you're talking about doubling the size of the grid or tripling the amount of energy we're going to take from the grid, you're going to want some kind of a comprehensive plan. We need to invest a bunch of money and do it very thoughtfully so that it can be as affordable as possible. And we still have a prosperous, affordable state. And I think we can do all those things, but this feels like a special moment in time when we can do that.
I think we're also seeing just how much leadership matters in that process and how much expertise matters. Think about the feelings that we all had when Dr. Shaw was speaking this morning, and Director Pingree sort of not even in jest observation that he was our celebrity guest today. I don't think that would have been true a few months ago, but we're just so so aware of what our scientific experts and our leaders can do to make really hard decisions and really hard transitions easier and more comprehensible, and keep us all focused on growing in the same direction here. And I hope that that's a lesson that we will carry with us as we continue to call on the expertise of the 250 some people who have been active in official roles on the Climate Council, and the many hundreds more who are, and thousands more who are engaged in this, and who we will need to engage to actually implement these great policy recommendations.
There's another thread I wanted to put out there, and I'm just putting it in the chat as well to everybody. And it's a little bit gimmicky, but it's, if you were tasked with putting a headline on what you just heard and what you all just presented, right? What is that headline, right? What's really, not just newsy, but what's really the story that's happening in this? And let's just play around with this for a little bit, and then I want to open up to Q&A to everybody. But just, if any thoughts on this, like what's really the story of those 3 presentations you just gave us?
Well, David, I had one which would apply to all 6 presentations, 3 which we have not yet heard for tomorrow. But and so the headline would be a vaccine for COVID-19 is coming. This is what a vaccine for climate change looks like. And that would cover the responses from both days.
Clever. Very nice. Other suggestions?
I think to Michael's point, when we started, I think there were a lot of people in the transportation working group who didn't think it was possible to meet them 80%. And I think the headline is, it's possible to meet the goals. And I think the modeling showed that. And it was interesting because I'm not sure everyone went into it thinking that it was possible.
David Kennigan here. I think many of us have heard in the course of the pandemic the idea of build back better. And I like and appreciate that and think it's appropriate to our circumstance as well. Though I might add to it, consistent with the point Kathleen just made, build back better boldly. I think that citizens are probably ahead of us on this. And while there are those charged with making noise and being naysayers, I think the public is seeing this light as it has the pandemic light, and is willing to move forward probably more than we anticipate.
Thanks.
I want to observe that we have a tendency as a state to beat ourselves up sometimes for not for being laggards at things, and I think we could take some pride in being at the head of the pack on some of the things that are being talked about. I think you could write headlines about how we're leading on things like electrification. You know, our state has installed 50,000 heat pumps in the last 5 to 6 years. That is the most in the country on a per capita basis. And we're doing the same thing with heat pump water heaters. So we can do things at scale that are leading the way for what the future looks like. We were one of the first states to adopt the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a regional approach to a regulatory regime for carbon, and then taking the proceeds from that and investing it wisely. A lot of other states didn't do anything very interesting or strategic with those revenues, but Maine has done something really strategic with it and reinvested it in fuel switching and energy conservation programs to help everyone from low income customers to the biggest paper mills in the state who are huge employers. So we were really strategic about that. And I guess I would say we've shown we can do it before, and I think this is an area where we could do it again.
I would just add that, agree with everything that other folks said, but that just there continues to be, and there is an opportunity through what we're suggesting to grow our economy and create good paying jobs for the state. And I think you're seeing that throughout a lot of these recommendations. They're not just with them come really significant economic opportunity. And I think we've started on that path, and I think there's more that this plan can help us do.
Great. Anything else we'd want to add on that front before we open it up to the overall council? Great. Well, I want to thank the 8 of you, the 6 of you for your great presentations, the 8 of you for your thoughtful comments now. I see Hannah Pingree has her hand up. Hannah, do you want to jump in on this?
I'm just very politely raising my hand. I do want to say that we've received tremendous amount of Q&A from also many of the public observers, and we cannot get to it all, but we are looking at your comments and we'll save the record and try to find ways to address it. But I did see a number of questions about what renewable natural gas is, questions about can you turn trees into fuel? And I think it kind of really spurs me to a question about just innovation, especially in the energy sector, that I wonder if maybe Dan or Ken might try to hit.
Great. So
yeah, sure.
Go ahead, please.
You want me to do that now? So the idea of and Michael, Ken, Kathleen, please fill in of a renewable fuel, right, is taking some other source of in the term of renewable natural gas. Typically that could be an organic waste that is or it could be oftentimes manure from farms. It could be food waste, turning that into usually through some sort of methanization, turning that into methane that can then be injected into a natural gas pipeline to potentially be used that way. And so that's an example of something that would be considered a renewable natural gas. But I think what we're suggesting is that we would need to do more work to identify the bounds and parameters of something like that. And I think the same exists potentially for the wood-based components as well. But that's a quick. Happy to answer other questions offline too.
I think it's important to observe that that's one example of a renewable natural gas. That's the most near-term commercially viable version, but there are a variety. And the reason I think it's worth keeping our attention on it, there are many reasons, but one is that there are other ways that you can make hydrogen-rich fuels a variety of ways. You can electrolyze water using renewable electricity. You could do that all day long if you have renewable energy and you have water. And I think we could do that. But I think it has some distance to go before it's commercially viable. But the point is there's a wide variety of ways that you can make renewable gas. And then you can use it the same way, similarly to how you use natural gas today. And that has some very practical potential applications and a very valuable role to supplement or complement what you can do well with electrification and some things that you can't do so well with electrification.
I would add to that, Michael's described it and Dan exactly right. If we have more electricity than we need, we could certainly use it constructively to hydrolyze water and create the hydrogen necessary to make it natural gas. The question is how rapidly the cost of that technology will decline vis-a-vis the other options that exist. If, for example, that cost stays reasonably high and the cost of heat pumps that operate at far lower temperatures declines, then even though it's possible to do it, it may not have a market compared to those super heat pumps. And that's the part that we don't know. And our biggest mistake would be assuming one thing or the other. We just have to keep our eye on the ball and try to plan as best we can against all these numerous options. It's a really exciting time because of these options. But yes, we have to remain attentive. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. So what I'd love to do is take a bunch of comments, probably not respond to them in real time, but let's work our way down through the folks who have their hands up. Let's start with Andrew. Andrew, please go ahead.
Hi, so a couple of quick things. First of all, I loved Ivan's headline. That was fantastic. I think we need it on a t-shirt. Second, I really appreciated the transportation groups calling out the kind of system level challenges that one thing we might address in one corner of our domain is going to be connected to other things. And I think that's really an important concept that the Climate Council is going to need to keep in mind, especially as we're looking across these different groups. And then the last thing is that I was a little surprised not to see carbon pricing discussed in any of the documents that we, or any of the presentations that we heard today. And forgive me if I missed it, but that just seems like one of these things that can cut across a lot of these issues and makes the kind of autonomous choices that people are going to make more efficient and more kind of climate ready. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And we'll respond. There is a response about the carbon pricing, and there is a mention, but I'll let folks answer that later. Go ahead, please, Representative.
Hi, sorry about that. I was really thinking about, the transportation, talking about public transportation, and that's always been a recommendation that we should improve public transportation. But in the light of this pandemic, I see it as the pandemic. This could be a one-off thing, or it could happen again. Where any of our recommendations have to reflect the reality that if we create a reliable public transportation system, it also has to be a healthy public transportation system that people are going to have to be able to trust in a future pandemic. So I guess that intersection of the effects of the pandemic on things like a good public transportation network and other things like the building and housing. How about you may have a very fuel efficient home, and it might be really tight. It doesn't allow for enough air exchange, things like that. I mean, I think that that one of the realities is that we're going to have to talk about this for the future, that how do these affects any of our recommendations, I guess was, and I didn't want to see what you thought in the transportation sector, especially about public transportation.
Thank you so much. Kate Dempsey?
To the point about how the pandemic shifted thinking, I'm really conscious of, there was I believe it's about 35%, I may be wrong on that, percentage of Mainers who still needed to continue to drive or get to work during the pandemic, and still do. So I'm really conscious that natural resource users, factory workers, grocery store workers, etc., are still commuting, and so that the beauty of sitting at home is not available to many Mainers. And I just want to make sure, the rural group thought about that, but keep elevating that type of disparity that we're witnessing during the pandemic as well. And I just also, when I saw one of the Q&As, Roger Stevenson brought up awesome integration of adaptation and into all of your thinking with the transportation group. So thanks.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. Your headset's being a little squirrely right now. I wonder if it's not feeding properly into your machine, or you're not grabbing it, just FYI. Anya, please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you all for all your presentations. It was really helpful and great to hear from all of you. I have a couple questions, mostly for the energy working group. Ken, just reflecting on the question about renewable natural gas, I personally feel a lot of concerns around that. Just number one, with those methane emissions that you were talking about, what the impact of those is, of that is. Also concerns about, is it worth expanding infrastructure and investing in that if the science hasn't caught up to it yet, and we have other ways of reaching our goals without expanding that infrastructure? I guess I'm just looking for like a little bit more elaboration on that. I also was hearing in your presentation about looking for strategies that allow for a just transition of jobs. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that, how we ensure a just transition with energy. And then one of the thoughts that I had with that was with the Green Bank, if you've thought about how that money could be prioritized for marginalized and frontline communities first. Yeah, so that's sort of 3 questions.
Thanks, Anya. Let's keep moving forward with comments, and then we can get some feedback. Stephen, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. basically agree with what was just said by Anya. A big thank you to all the co-chairs of the subgroups. Great presentations. For energy, I have similar concerns about furthering investment in infrastructure and any kind of technology that involves combustion, especially if it involves a significant amount of physical consumption, whether that's waste to energy facilities or even biofuels or biomass that are derived from wood. As much as I want to support the industry here for forestry, I don't think fuel should be the direction that we should be taking. I'm definitely a big supporter of the Green Bank, and also I absolutely believe that we should be looking at not only all the suggestions that you offered on the energy side of things, but specifically having a utility that is publicly owned. I feel like that would be the only way that we could be nimble enough and be able to make the kinds of adjustments that are needed to see this all come to fruition. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Sandy Buck.
All right, thanks. First of all, thanks everybody for all the time and effort you've put in. It's if there's ever anything that's inspiring in this world these days, it's all the effort that the working group members and council members have put into this. So I'm hopeful. I've got three questions, or I guess they're questions, maybe observations. I guess they're questions. Early on in the process, there was a lot of talk about the promise of the Transportation Climate Initiative. I know it's controversial, and I'm wondering, are we going to be able to meet our transportation emissions goals without implementing something like TCI? That's one. Another is, I think there's great promise with offshore wind, and I just wanted to make sure that as we're considering really ramping up offshore wind to meet its promise and potential, that we're taking into account the effects on wildlife habitat, commercial fishing zones, and then visual impacts as well, and what will be the forum for those kinds of discussions. And my third is a question about the Green Bank. Agree that really seems like a promising way to jumpstart a lot of these technologies that'll be expensive over time. I'm thinking that the state right now it's looking like the state is going to be on the hook for getting a Green Bank up and running, but I'm wondering if there has been some consideration working with private investors, particularly those interested in socially responsible investing, to look for ways to jumpstart these technologies and these practices. Maybe not take the top dollar investment return, but see where the benefits can go and get a meaningful return on investment. So thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Are there other reactions we want to share or conversation we want to have right now? Pat Strauch? Pat, go ahead, please.
Hi, just I thought the presentations were great, and I'm thinking of the forest industry more as not really land managers and manufacturers, but carbon managers these days. We move carbon in a lot of different directions, and it's complicated. So I look forward to more discussions about this carbon cycle that we're a part of. And one example of the complication is that we will sequester carbon in our trees, but in order to do that, and we'll sequester it in solid wood products, but we're going to have some mill wastes that amount to about 2 million tons. And options for that waste are landfilling or using it as energy. So how we use our carbon is a lot more complicated than saying, we don't like this part of how we use our carbon. So I look forward to more discussions, and I think our forests are going to be a big part of the solution. They already are, and as they relate to energy and embedded carbon, we're going to have some great discussions about that as we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Pat. Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Great presentations from all the panelists. I just have one quick comment. The governor also recently created a council to advise on long-term economic development and recovery. And I think a lot of what our council is doing is going to overlap with their work and should inform their work and vice versa. So I hope that over the coming months, we give some thought towards collaborating with that group so that we're working kind of hand in glove and not at counter purposes. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, so there was a couple of questions that were posed specifically that maybe co-chairs can help answer. And I know Director Pingree might have a comment about Dan's comment just now. But so I wonder if I can just turn it over to the co-chairs if you were taking notes on some of those questions we can answer right now. Otherwise, we'll weave those into the meeting summary and get some answers later. But there are some quick answers to some of these questions. I know there is a reference to carbon, the price of carbon in there. So Ken and Dan, maybe you can answer that. Some other questions around how TCI was handled, some other things like that people could jump in real quick. Let's just take 5 minutes. So these are quick hit answers, folks. But co-chairs, could you help us out?
Sure, David. This is Ken. I can start with a couple. In terms of carbon pricing, the Energy Work Group did include that. It was one of the recommendations on the financing side that we should give much more consideration to. And it was a significant interest on the part of the members of the Energy Working Group as well. Anya mentioned power to gas, and is that a good idea? And what about the emissions from the gas that's created with that additional power? When you hydrolyze water, you take the hydrogen, but then you combine it with a carbon molecule to create methane. So you have to get that carbon molecule from somewhere. Presumably it would be out of the air. And so power to gas should be reasonably carbon neutral. Her other question was about, is it wise to be working on that infrastructure when we have so many other needs and opportunities? And that's a cost question, which is quite appropriate. We shouldn't be doing the options that work equally well but are more expensive. We should be doing the less expensive ones. And then Sandy's mentioned about private investment in green banks is a good one. Many green banks are private in their initial capitalization, are public-private partnerships. I would hope that our approach would do likewise. And I think all green banks are working on how good and attentive are their equity issues. Thanks.
Great.
Hey,
Other
David.
co-chairs?
Yeah, I can address some of the transportation. The public transportation, really, you nailed it, because Metro Portland's down, or had been down 90% of its ridership. And many of those people are riding that bus because they have no other choice. And I don't know if people know, but bike shops right now are literally sold out of bikes. You can't find a child's bike right now. And people don't want to be on that transit system. They would prefer to walk and ride. And I think what it tells us is we need to have a safe system for people to ride a bike and to walk so they feel safe. And that's a real legitimate choice for them. We talked about in our group that buses may look different in the future, maybe more micro buses, smaller, more targeted stop-go locations. Interestingly, before the pandemic, we saw Go Maine as a rideshare program here in Maine, and public transit as a quick win. We kind of said, maybe not a quick win right now until there's a vaccine. So, but I still think they're legitimate strategies or actions. But there's more work to be done there. To the point about some people having to go to work, I would also just point out, we didn't share this, but there's a good significant number of trips people take that are not commuter trips. It's people going to the doctor, it's people going to the grocery store. And there is a real need to figure out, we as a state through DHHS spend a ton of money on driving people on these one-off trips. And we talked a lot about that. Is there some synergy there? So, I mean, that's money that's already being spent, that if we could find a way to find solutions around that, to share rides, could be a real quick win or a synergy. In terms of TCI, we talked about it a lot in transportation. We did not have wide support for it. And so it is in our written strategy. Today, Sarah and I just covered the things that were really areas of emphasis our group could agree on. I would say that myself and Dan Burgess, Jeff Crawford from DEP, as state officials, continue to participate in those meetings with the other states. We're listening, we're observing, but they don't really have anything to react to yet. So we're just still waiting on that. But it is in our written strategy.
I've lost track of all the questions, David. Thanks for putting Jerry on the spot on all the rest of them. But I mean, I think we have recorded this, and there's a lot of good areas for discussion among the council. I will just say, to Dan's point, our office is supporting the staffing of the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee. And I think even in the comments that Jerry and I and Dr. Shaw made, I think we see a lot of overlap. And one of our projects this summer, sort of as a staff, but working with both Climate Council members and interested working group members, is really thinking more deeply about the Clean Energy Economy Plan, because there's many areas of overlap. I would say we are advising the innovation as well as the manufacturing group of the Economic Recovery Group, because we see overlap. These two groups totally need to be in concert and not sort of reinventing the wheels. And we have some good areas of both staffing and member overlaps. Matt Schlobohm, who's somewhere in this Zoom screen, is also on both councils, and I think he offers a pretty important perspective and overlap as well. I will just say that I think the issues of funding are ones that are really important for this council to dig in on the fall. There's not easy answers. In a recession, there are obviously hopes for what Congress might eventually do, but there's, again, it's an area where many of these strategies do require funding. Even a green bank, a tremendous idea and opportunity, it requires us to come up with a funding source, whether partially private or public. It still requires money. So I think that's the difficult work that staff is going to dig into this summer and dig into the recommendations, but really look to this group as well in the fall as we prioritizing those things that we can really make happen in an effective way with probably limited funds. That will be our major challenge. We're going to talk briefly about it again tomorrow, but we are doing a cost-benefit analysis of the strategies, trying to understand the economic and other aspects of each of the strategies that you've heard about today. You've heard mention of modeling, and that modeling has been finished in some areas but not completed, so that will be something available to this council and the public over the course of the summer, at least by fall, because it's important to know where do each of these strategies get us when it comes to specific emissions reductions. We also, you may hear about it a little bit tomorrow, but we've done as part of that a report on the cost of doing nothing. So really understanding if we don't take action, what does it mean? What will sea level rise and flooding and temperature changes mean for our economy, mean for our flood prone communities, mean for our working waterfront? So those are also important things for us to factor in. As we think about the cost of action, we also need to understand the cost of inaction. So that's something you'll hear a lot more about over the course of the summer and fall.
Thanks, Hannah Pingree. I think why don't we transition into a short presentation, a handful of slides that Hannah Pingree and Commissioner Reed have about the public outreach and engagement that's going to happen. I think it's important to lead today with a vision of what's going to be going on, and then tomorrow we'll pick up that theme again. Hannah, if you want to speak for a moment about what's being thought of in terms of a real push in the coming months to engage a wide group of folks.
Great, thank you, David. So I think you heard throughout the presentations today, we had a huge number of people engaged in the working groups, in the Science and Technical Subcommittee, public members weighing in and offering comments throughout the process, but we still don't think that's enough. And so our original design for this Climate Council process was a significant roadshow this spring with large public meetings in which people could offer their comments. We were imagining packed gymnasiums and small working groups. Obviously, that has been challenged by this pandemic, and we decided to put it off until it was safe, until we were safely able to do so. And it's actually changed our process into one that now is kind of coming after the strategies have been developed, which in some ways offers an opportunity for Mainers to really weigh in and help us understand what's most important to them, what are they most worried about, how could some of these strategies be best implemented on the ground in their communities. And so our goal, you'll hear a little bit more about it, is over the summer to kick off a process that really engages Maine people, as many people as possible, to help them understand the work the council is doing, the details we know about Maine's changing climate and its impacts on our wildlife, on our economy, on our public health. And then we want to hear from people. So that is really the whole point of public engagement. And the way that we're going to do that is both through a new and very robust website that allows people to learn about the process, but also weigh in, as well as smaller group meetings where we're safely able to do so. So starting tomorrow, this website up here, climatecouncil.maine.gov, will launch, and it will add on more and more information throughout the summer. The idea is that some of the presentations you heard today and tomorrow will be available. We'll have, you can read the entire report of the working groups, or you can sort of see the summary information so you can dig in and really understand what's happening. And the important part of all of what we've been doing is to make sure that Maine people feel they have a voice. I've been incredibly heartened to sort of read what I've seen in the Q&A in the chat from the public and working group members during this meeting. People have a lot of specific ideas. They have concerns. They have things that they think will and will not work for their communities, and they have questions. So the idea of this website, which will be iterative, it will change over time and have more and more content added, is that it really will give people an ability to weigh in over the course of the summer. So some of the ways that people will be able to do that is through a general survey. We'll ask people to help prioritize the strategies they think will work best in their community or for their family or for the state. And we'll also have kind of a downloadable toolkit so people can help us continue this conversation with their friends and family through small group discussions. So again, the whole purpose is to create greater connections. Our concept is this will launch tomorrow, but starting the second week of July, we'll do sort of a 6-week push. And the idea is to get as many people in Maine as possible to weigh in. I think, our original thought was that summer in Maine is not the best time to ask people their opinions, but a lot of us are at home, or they're at home with kids. People clearly care a lot about the state, and we have a belief, I think, partially because of the interest today and the interest from all of you, that people really will want to engage with this process. They want to be a part of it. And ideally, we capture them, we ask their opinions, and then folks are sort of with us as we go through this through the fall. They can stay up to date on the progress, on the final recommendations and report. And this whole project clearly does not end on December 1 when we deliver a report to the legislature and governor. This is really the beginning of a 4-year action plan where we need people to be participating. We need people to be making these actions happen in their home communities and their own lives. And so I think that's kind of the beginning of public engagement, is asking people to weigh in, and the sort of end is keeping them with us as we all figure out how to chart this course together. Jerry, I don't know, do you want to add anything to this? The Department of Environmental Protection does a lot of public engagement in their work. And Jerry's been incredibly helpful as we think this through.
Yeah, Hannah, the only thing I'd add is I think this website's going to be amazing, but I don't want anybody to have the impression that we're going to be relying on the website kind of passively to do all our public engagement work for us. That's not the case. We're going to be talking very actively with the working group chairs and others about who out there needs to be engaged, who hasn't yet been sufficiently engaged, and And we're going to be reaching out and affirmatively engaging those people and groups and entities to make sure that we have heard from everybody who we can conceive of who has a stake in these discussions. So it'll be a very active and affirmative process too.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. And that is super important. The 80 to 100,000 people in Maine without access to the internet. People, we know from our Zoom calls, people have really poor access to the internet in some areas. We have, people who are busy during the summer who don't have time to weigh in. There are groups of fishermen and seniors and other communities who we really want to make a point to reach out. And actually, David, who's on this call, is among the folks who will help us do that. And you'll also hear a little bit more tomorrow, but through our equity audit, a project we're doing with the University of Maine, part of that is to also make sure that we're really asking people to engage. We're looking for people's opinions, and we know not every opinion will be like-minded. We have people who think we should be going faster and further, and people who think we shouldn't be doing any of this at all, and we really want to hear from everyone.
Thanks, Hannah and Jerry. That's great. And I would say there are still 252 people observing this and listening in and joining us right now, in addition to the 53 council members and co-chairs. And for those folks who are listening in, if you would like the Climate Council through Hannah Pingree's staff and others to come talk to your organization, please contact us, right? That is one of the key pieces, is us going out and meeting you where you are. So we want to encourage folks to reach out, and we are proactively going to be trying to figure out those who have been least involved in this process to date, and those who are hardest to reach, particularly virtually, and to figure out creative ways of doing that. Okay, so we have time for a quick round with everyone here on that participation plan and outreach plan, because this is an opportunity, if you want to weigh in, to say, these are particularly important voices or groups of folks who you need to put some extra emphasis on this summer as you're going out and doing it. So I think this is an opportunity. If you have some ideas, shout them out now, throw them in the chat. Who do we need to reach, and what do we need to be asking people, right? So we have, let's say we got another 5-10 minutes before we close up the day here. Are there people who want to weigh in on that question of who really do we need to be reaching out to very proactively over the summer? And what really are we trying to do out there, and the questions we're trying to ask folks, building off Hannah and Jerry's good description. Any thoughts from our Climate Council members right now? Jesse, go ahead, please.
Thank you. One thing that's on my mind, I'm the executive director of the Bethel Area Chamber of Commerce over here, and of course, thinking about tourism and those 37 million people that we'll only be seeing a small fraction of this summer, I'm sure. If there's a way to capture tourist attitudes towards taking public transportation, helping us meet our climate goals, this might be a tough summer to do it, but I do think it's important because tourists outnumber us dramatically, and if they're not playing along, it might be tough to reach some of those goals. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks so much, Jesse. Yeah. Other thoughts, advice, Matt?
A couple of constituency groups that I would just lift up. I mean, I think we've all lived through very counterproductive jobs versus the environment fights over the years that end up being harmful to workers and to the environment. And I just think anything we can do to avoid those. So clearly reaching out to workers, whether it's lobstermen, fishermen, mill workers, others, to just invite ideas, to tap into that deep love of place and wild places that I think exists across working people in this state, and just really try to front end issues so as to avoid divisions. I think clearly young people are going to solve this crisis for us if we're going to solve it, and the generation that's demanding structural change needs to be really at the forefront. So just deeply involving those voices and perspectives, and the ones that I think challenge us to be a little better and think a little bigger and demand a little more are really important. And then I would just lift up immigrants and communities of color. We've all talked in multiple spaces about disparities. You know, lots of immigrants are often climate refugees in certain cases and bring a lot of deep knowledge there. And just as we start to think about the relationship between our economy and an aging workforce and how to grow population in Maine and all of those things in this moment, that feels really important. And I think asking for feedback, I think asking for ideas, I think this body has done a good job of being creative on ways to engage folks, but I think we need to make the kind of cultural shifts we need. We have to both educate on the scale of the crisis and invite people in. And I guess the other piece I would just ask people is like, how do we make this a more compelling vision? Because in some ways that feels a bit like our meal ticket out. If it's trying to get people to operate out of fear that we're doomed, that is much more paralyzing than we can create a better way to be together and to live together. And so just asking people to envision that would be, I think, helpful.
Thanks, Matt.
David, this is Christina Ford. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
One of the things that I thought, I think this has been a magnificent job of presenting all the work that we've done. And I'm a planner, and I'm interested in the next steps, and I'm interested always in things that sound like they're easy and they're not. And in particular, in talking about the participation, I wrote down, and this is from the energy group, that they wanted, the phrase they used is seek to minimize impacts on affected industries. And I just thought, I'm in Booth Bay, and we've had conversations about the floating wind turbines that might come, they might send that electricity up here. And the people who feel like and come to the meetings and say this isn't going to work are the fishermen. And so I think we can't just be seeking for other members of the choir to talk to. I think we need to, in a concerted way, when we have something that has some teeth in it, to be talking to people who aren't naturally predisposed to think this is a good idea. And that's hard. I know it's really hard, but I think otherwise we'll get blindsided by the reactions from people who we know they're there, but we haven't enlisted their input.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah. Let's go to Stephen, and then I know Anya's trying to get in, but she can't raise her hand. But Stephen first, and then Anya.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo everything that Matt said previously, all the groups that he mentioned. I appreciate that being raised. Obviously, representing the Katahdin region here as a town councilor in Millinocket, I think it's important that people in this region get to have their concerns raised as well. One reason because they're heavily invested in the wood products, and I think that could be representative for the rest of the state as well in that area, but also representative of a rural type of region that's trying to reinvent itself. And I think the concerns might very well fit into some of the questions we're asking of how do we redefine our economy that can also look at all these environmental issues. I think this is a perfect example of how we can address that for rural, lower income areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Anya?
Yeah, sorry, I had to switch to my phone. And I've been thinking a lot about Dr. Shaw's words earlier, talking about all these marginalized and frontline communities that climate change might not be the top priority right now because they're fighting for human rights or land sovereignty or justice in some other ways. And so just, I guess, making sure that we're asking those questions as well and being able to support those groups as they participate.
Thanks, Anya. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm not seeing additional hands right now. Thanks everyone for that really helpful input. And obviously you all can be as involved as you want in this process. And we would welcome your involvement in helping what needs to happen over the summer in terms of reaching out. So, Hannah Pingree and her whole team is a great contact point for that. And we would certainly welcome your involvement in what will be an aggressive effort over the summer. Okay, we have managed to do day one. And thank you, everybody. I can't believe 3.5 hours is a very tough slog. We're going to do it again tomorrow, and I'll turn it over to Hannah and Jerry. I've just slipped into first names. Sorry, folks. I'll turn it back over to Hannah and Jerry to finish up any concluding thoughts for today before we sign off.
You can call us Hannah and Jerry anytime, David. I just want to again just echo. I think that I really today should be finished with a thank you of just the tremendous amount of work that the co-chairs as well as their working group members and support staff and others have helped pull off. Obviously, we're midway through, and in some ways it's a beginning for the council, but so much heavy lifting happened during an incredibly challenging time. So thank you. I was definitely inspired by the 3 presentations. There are so many ideas in front of us to help us accomplish the hard work we've been asked to do. So now I think there's a roadmap. There's more pieces and information and opinions we need to add to it. But we really, there's I think a lot for us that now there. I know all of you over the course of the summer are going to read the working group reports in detail. Actually, there are hundreds of pages that I think the folks on your Zoom screen have helped to pull off. And again, my team is going to help add more context and analysis to that to help you wade through it all. But again, just a huge, huge thank you, because these presentations just represent, I think, as you heard today in the panel, just a lot of hope about the potential for what we are able to do. I think that it's possible. Whose t-shirt idea was that? Whose headline? It's possible is I think where we all are. It's possible, I think, with our continued focus on how to turn the ideas into political reality. So again, just a huge, huge thank you to all those who spent months leading up to today. Jerry.
Yeah, let me just end by saying, of all the horribly unfair things that we asked of the working group chairs over the months, asking them to cram 9 months or so of incredibly complicated work into 20-minute presentations might have been the most unfair thing yet. But you did an incredible job, and it was a huge success. So huge thank you to all of you.
Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.